And, ooh, meeting recorded. Okay.
Yeah, I'm going to start now because you're saying something interesting.
Oh, okay.
As opposed to
I can
everybody
start
else.
over. I've been using Neumann Solution D for quite some time. In fact, almost since it came out. I was using some porta drives for my field location work, which um, lasted me for about 5 years, by contrast to some of the Nagras I've had, which have never died, but still. Um, anyway, the porta drive came with 6 onboard analog preamps, but it would record 8 channels right up to 96 kilohertz. And I thought, well, a pair of those Neumann Solution Ds would be nice for those filling in those last 2 channels. And I'm always carrying a laptop around with me on location, so I could control them very easily. Anyway, I started trying them out in various facilities, which I suspected they probably wouldn't work in. One of the places I first tried them out in was Portland Center for the Performing Arts, and was able to run them successfully from the mic inputs, the XLR mic inputs on the stage, all the way back to the control booth, right up to 192 kilohertz. Wow. And I thought, well, that's interesting. Then there was a school in Vancouver where some of my clients were performing. You plug an analog microphone in on stage, go back to the sound booth, plug it into your machine, crank up the gain, and in the background, I remember this, you are listening to ABC Radio News. The digital microphones went through the same lines, clean as a whistle. Sure. But by contrast, I have used some high-end audio cable interconnect between the microphone and the control box, and have occasionally lost it at 25 feet. So this is an iffy situation, but as it turned out, most of the places I've been able to work in have accommodated Solution D very nicely, and up into the high sampling rates. I was able to run through all of the snakes in Arlene Schnitzer Concert Hall as long as my workstation was on stage, and mics were hung, a control box was put up in the lighting grid for the stage of that concert hall, and then some Ravenna or some IP cables, Cat6 cables were run down to my workstation, and I was in business. And Arlene Schnitzer Concert Hall was very generous to me, because after I showed that off to them, they suddenly started installing all over the place Cat6 cable, because they knew that this was a technology that was coming forward, and especially with the Dante and some others, that that's the way the shows were going to be coming in, and so I've had it a little more easy access to some of that than I used to have. Cool. And so
do you
anyway,
have pictures of this?
I maybe I should set up something for the weeks ahead, because I do have some pictures to show some of it off.
Great.
So
please do.
Anyway,
doesn't that sound interesting, everybody?
But anyway, I have 24 channels of the Solution D, 3 DMI8 control boxes, 2 of which are Ravenna protocol that work into at least one of the older versions of Animan.
Great. I'm going to cut you off here, because we're going into David's time here.
Okay.
To some extent, but let's have you do this in the future, as soon as you want to, and if you can do it next week, that would be swell. But whenever you want.
Probably not next week because I have a recording job that weekend, but maybe the weekend after. So
great. That sounds wonderful. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay.
So it's 3:36, everybody. Welcome and thank you for coming. And we'll start off with David talking about Telefunken and its marketing history. And after that, we'll have introductions. And then after that, we'll talk about what we're going to do. So everybody ready for that? I'll take that as a yes. Rick, what are you shaking your hand about? You're shaking up something.
Oh, VF14. No.
I can't see what it is. Talk so we can see it.
Nail polish.
Oh.
He's going to do his nails while David's talking.
No, I'm gonna add a code to my Shure donut mounts so that when they get intermixed with other people's mounts, I can sort them out because they're expensive enough that I hate losing them.
Yeah.
I'll buy some nail polish remover then.
Yeah, you would.
Hey, Rick, that's why I do this to all my my stuff.
What is that? A sticker?
Yeah, I've got Luke Pack, and then what is this? EV661. So I know what it is, and other people don't take it.
Yeah, I have stickers also. Let's see.
The brother system there?
They sometimes peel off when you slide it into a clip, though.
Yeah.
I mean, I went to what's their faces on Elliott, and got them.
Radar?
No, it's a place that does labeling.
Oh.
Just up the road from the Bend to Magnolia, and well before the Ballard Bridge. Names escaping me right now. They make commercial labels for people, and they do. GM nameplate.
That's who I was thinking of.
And these are pretty durable. They don't really peel. I've seen better, but they're serviceable. So it just has the company name, a phone number, and an asset number, and then I have a spreadsheet that converts asset number to serial number and model.
Cool. Okay, thank you. Let's start with Dave. Let's get David's presentation rolling here. And thanks again for doing this, David.
Oh, my pleasure. I had a really good time working on this as far as it goes. All right, so here's the thing. I'm using a PowerPoint deck, and I don't plan on physically showing anything during this time. So if you want to banish my image from your screen, I don't think you'll miss anything except possibly the glare off of my glasses, because there's some stuff I need to read. But there's no plus in seeing my face during this, I think. So I'm actually going to minimize myself.
So if everybody goes to the top of that little thumbnail window or to the side, there's 4 little icons, and the single horizontal line one causes everybody to disappear, including you. Okay, thanks.
Yeah. So here's some disclaimers. I did this for fun because I was asked and challenged to do it. It pulls together a lot of things that I'm interested in, but I'm, as I said, not a historian. And Telefunken isn't my area. If I have an area of specialty, it's Schoeps, not Telefunken. Plus, I feel a lot of compassion for anybody if they decide to make Telefunken their area of specialty, because Telefunken went out of business in the 80s and massively discarded their paper records. So it's just sort of heartbreaking if you care about this stuff, because companies do this a lot. Schoeps has done a fair amount of it. It just drives me up a wall. So that reconstructing things is difficult or impossible, and you can't really be sure of a lot of your best guesses. Plus, this topic unfolds during the time mostly between the world wars and the time around World War II and since, which is, for me personally, it's really upsetting to research it because all the stuff having to do with microphones, sound equipment, technology is inextricably intertwined with propaganda, with partisanship, with the Nazis. This is true for both Neumann and Schoeps. And yeah, it just, like it becomes intolerable sometimes. There are times when I just can't work on this because I'm finding out I've been studying more and more of the history of the period, and it makes you crazy. Lastly, I do have this bias toward Schoeps, especially. I've had long personal and business relationships with them. I use their microphones. I prefer their microphones generally, although I have an awful lot of respect for Neumann and some for the older AKGs. But you should know that, I'm not independent completely. So Telefunken, as the slide says, started at the beginning of last century. And I realized here, I said between two large competing companies. I need to emphasize how large, and I'm not sure that I can. Those are the two biggest industrial corporations that were involved in early electricity and power generation and communications. They they did both civilian and military work. They made like fighter aircraft for the German army in World War I. AEG in particular was a huge military contractor, second only to Krupp Industries, the big weapons supplier. So they were very intertwined with the government, with the military, and they were inclined toward big projects, things that used many, many tons of iron and steel. This is a photograph from 1906, and this guy in one of the two funny hats is the Emperor, I'm sorry, Kaiser Wilhelm II. And this guy over here, who I think was pasted into the picture, because he doesn't look as if he's in the same space with everybody else, is and a general in his army. There are other famous people here too, but one of them, this guy here, was the head of Telefunken at this time. They both Siemens and AEG. AEG translates to General Electric Corporation, but the two were not the same. We're trying to get into wireless telegraphy, which at the time was spark gaps. And this picture shows the visit of the Emperor to an experimental 10 kilowatt spark gap transmitter now in Germany. I wonder how you would like to have your recording studio next door to something that's sending out 10 kilowatt spark communications. But Telefunken itself was a fairly large company, and we're concerned when we're talking about condenser microphones and audio equipment for studios, for broadcasters, recording studios, and the like, with a division of that company, which I'll narrow it down to shortly. I'm going to basically skip this screen. I do want to I went into it before about how the social side of all this is really inseparable from it if you're studying this at all seriously, but I'm not going to give you people a history lesson about what was going on in Europe.
And since we've already interrupted you, do you want questions as you go, or do you want people to hold them?
Well, really, do people have any so far? Because it's all been so basic.
Been pretty straightforward so far, but
Yeah.
if something comes up.
Yeah, if something bothers you, or if you know clearly more than I do, which is very probable that it's on some slide or other we're going to hit that situation, please step in. This again is so general that I don't want to beat you with it, but all this stuff was new in the 20s, and when communications technology is new, it has this strange effect on people's minds to where they start taking literally what they're hearing and seeing. Like people who really believe that the people on the Friends TV show had an apartment like that, or like when actors play a villain, they find that people accost them on the street and start yelling at them for what they did, not realizing that they're actors. So that was kind of going on a mass scale in Germany in the 20s. Yeah, all this. Broadcasting, big difference between broadcasting in Central Europe and broadcasting in America is that it was government licensed in America, but privately done and commercial right away in the United States. In Central Europe, it was government based, not commercial, and centralized to varying degrees. In Germany, it was largely regional. In France, it was completely centralized. So that'll become important later, because the purchasing authority for the radio broadcasters was centralized. And that had a big impact on what kinds of microphones were produced and who was making them and who was buying them. So here's the first microphone porn, so-called. It's Neumann, except I think the picture is partly a fake. And the reason I say that is this was ostensibly the first Neumann microphone commercially produced. The picture is taken from Pressler's big coffee table book that came out 6 or 8 years ago. I think that the badge was tacked on later. One of the essential points about Telefunken's representation is that they only sold products that had Telefunken's badge on them. If you were distributed by Telefunken, then you had to agree to take your own brand name off and put theirs on. So I think for the purpose of this picture that they probably put a Neumann badge onto a microphone that either had no badge or a Telefunken badge, but that's just me. The deal there was what's called OEM. The older people in the audience know what that is. This is a pair of photographs that I took at Schoeps last year. I was cleaning out their attic. There's labor as well as reward in all of this. And I found this carton full of wrapped up tubes, took them out, sorted them out, and I found 5 different versions of a housing tube for the CM61 microphone with 4 different brands. And that's exactly the difference between a Siemens, a Telefunken, a Schoeps, and a Philips CM61, or in the case of Philips, they had a completely different model number for it that you can see engraved on this tube down here, an EL number. It's not like that Schoeps or Neumann or AKG ever sent their microphones to Telefunken and Telefunken changed the labels on them. There's a contract that's drawn up before any of this stuff gets made and sold. And in that contract, they work out exactly what logo they're going to use, how big it's going to be, what it's going to look like. All of that stuff is agreed on in advance and signed, and then the microphones get made. It's always in that order.
What was happening with that 5th one that was blank?
that's available to be engraved any old way that was needed.
Huh.
That's the precursor of all the others.
Cool. Thank you.
Because like, what if they signed a deal with Studer? Studer represented Schoeps in some countries for a while. So that was entirely possible. Okay, so companies have divisions, and the division of Telefunken that distributed condenser microphones and other studio equipment and broadcast and communications equipment, of sound equipment generally, was called the ELA division, because an ELA Anlage in German is a sound system. So ELA has come to be the general term for sound systems, and it still is used today. That's the word. Mostly it means a PA system. That's the sort of central meaning of ELA. So the ELA Abteilung was their division for this sort of stuff, and as the slide says, now you can all speak German. In the product listings of the ELA Abteilung, condenser microphones got a kind of special treatment. And I'll show you this later. They had crystal microphones, they had dynamic microphones, they had carbon microphones before they had condenser microphones. But when condenser microphones came along, they were pretty consistent about using an M, meaning microphone, followed by a number that was just consecutively assigned as far as I can see in most cases. So the full name of the product from Telefunken's marketing standpoint was ELA M, some number. There were other naming systems in use at the time. As I said, the German broadcasters, although they were regionally somewhat independent until the Nazis took power, they had a working group called the ARD that was their central administration, and it assigned names and numbers to all the products that it recommended or authorized for purchase by the stations. And this combined basically purchasing power and influence that they had made them the largest single collective customer in Germany for microphones and some related equipment. They published a series of standards and test reports in a series of books with brown covers called the Brown Books. And those went through many revisions and the responsibility got passed along to another organization later, long story. But those names differed from the manufacturer's names generally. And they differed from Telefunken's names in many cases. So there sometimes were as many as 3 different designations for the same thing. And that makes for a lot of fun when you're sorting out the early stuff. I'll show you a little table of how they relate in the case of early Neumann. Again, I can skip stuff here. Oh yeah, one important point is down here. Conceptually and linguistically, when you're looking in the 20s, 30s, 40s, and for more conservatively minded people as far as into the 50s, and you're talking about condenser microphones, then the word microphone may be a capsule. Some of the designers, and I'm including both Neumann and Schoeps in this, at least in the early years, when they wrote microphone, they meant capsule. And a patent for a microphone, at least if you look at the patent document itself, it says it's for a microphone, it's really a patent for a capsule. And the amplifier was considered to be an accessory to the microphone. Remind me when we get to Schoeps, because there's a big example of that. And Telefunken's designation for accessories was MZ. Z is Zubehör, which is an accessory. All right, so Neumann was the first condenser microphone manufacturer. commercial manufacturer. Neumann was the first supplier of microphones to Telefunken. I don't believe, from what I've seen, that Telefunken was the original. I think that Neumann must have been producing stuff and selling it before they signed up with Telefunken, because otherwise there's just too long a stretch between when they started producing things and when Telefunken's ELA division even existed. Because Neumann started producing things before he started his company in 28. He was making capsules at least in 27. And the Telefunken ELA division started in 31, although the parent companies both had ELA divisions, and they may have distributed Neumann, and that's something I would love to find out. So if anybody knows anything about that, please, I'd love to know. Neumann was not only into microphones, they was at least as interested in record cutting systems. And in fact, during the years before the war, he probably did more development on other things than on microphones, because he's got the same, basically only 5 models of capsule ever during that entire stretch of time, and 2 amplifiers, and only 3 microphones at a time at any one time. He started out with what we would today classify as a large diaphragm pressure transducer. That's a very understandable first product. The pressure gradient, or what we now consider to be directional capsules, was not widely understood. The theory and the design parameters were not a public thing. They were under patent. I'll show you how that changed. And it appears, and it's been said, although I can't confirm it myself, so I'm not sure I want to state it as a fact, that the cardioid and figure 8 capsules that Neumann eventually made were in fact designed by the 2 guys who published the textbook, which is Braunmühl and Weber, who are better known for something else that they did, and we'll get to them in a minute. But so the beginnings were pressure transducers. And in our experience today, pressure transducers means omni microphones. But when you have something that's like 33 millimeters across, which these were, they are not omnidirectional except at the bottom end. And I'm going to show you the patent, because Neumann filed a pair of patents on his capsule. And you can see that in the calculations, he chooses as his upper limit 10 kilohertz. And that size is very much a part of that. So here's his first patent. And the second patent is just for a relatively minor improvement. It has to do with the bass response, where he puts in 2 additional an additional ring-shaped chamber that would show up in 2 places on the diagram here. But if you look in this part, I don't know what resolution you have, but it's a bunch of calculations about the distance of the diaphragm, the depth of the holes drilled into the diaphragm, and it's all, the goal is to create a resonant effect in these drilling spaces, which become like Helmholtz resonators. And you want them to have a resonant frequency that's above the range that's your working range for the capsule itself. So he did his calculations to give this a 10 kilohertz resonance, which tells you what his ambitions were. And at the time, that to have reasonably flat response to 10 kilohertz was a big deal, but the only radio available then was AM or long wave, and records weren't hi-fi either, so that was good enough for a lot of people. And here are plots of his first 2 capsule designs. This is a huge peak at 10 kilohertz, goes off the scale, so it's about I'm sorry, not 10 kilohertz, but 10 dB. This is a revised version that's smoother and more extended. And what I wanted to show you was the way that his capsules were constructed. This part is or here, although this may not be a Neumann, this part is part of the microphone body. It's the amplifier. This cap screws onto the amplifier body beneath it. And the capsule is this part, which has a connector in the center and screws into this socket so that the capsules could be interchanged. They could be put up on a gooseneck. They actually had passive goosenecks of various lengths that went between the amplifier and the capsule, and you'll see those in a lot of World War II pictures of various officials of the government speaking into these bottle microphones. And this is my best reconstruction of what the early models actually were. And these three in the middle come from a Telefunken catalog, so I'm quite sure of them. It says specifically that these capsules on these amplifiers were what these microphones were. But Neumann definitely had an earlier capsule, and I don't know what amplifier it was for. And I was at Neumann in Berlin about 10 years ago, and I asked Martin Schneider about it, and he said he doesn't know either. He could never figure out what their business model was, and he wished that someday he could get a day in the basement of Microtech Gefell, because they apparently have all the old files, but I don't think that they let people see them. And there is this later improved pressure transducer that I don't know whether Telefunken ever distributed it, or what amplifier it was used with, although presumably it could have been used with the other two. The difference between the 3 and the 3A is simply this mechanical form of attachment. This is called a torpedo head because when you look at it from the side, it's tapered like a torpedo or a bullet. This version of the amplifier used a tall stalk-like appendage on the capsule. And typically the pressure transducers were used with the torpedo head, whereas the ostensibly directional capsules, the cardioid-ish and the figure 8, worked on those stalks. I think maybe to give them some space around them so that the size of the bottle didn't mess up the polar pattern too much. Yeah, the first capsule that you see in any Telefunken listing, or at least that I've been able to find, the first microphone is called an M14. I have no idea what that was exactly. Again, if these are the documents I have are from these years, and if anybody knows where to find Telefunken ELA price sheets or equipment lists from other years in the early 30s, I'd be very grateful to find that out. The 3A comes in a couple years later, and you get these two capsules. As I told you, there are 3 different naming systems. This cardioid capsule got to be kind of famous under its Brown Book name, which was the name that the radio broadcasters gave it, M7. Neumann didn't call it that. They called it the CM8. And here's a listing from 33. This is already in the Nazi period. And it lists a single condenser microphone. Is that on? Whoa, sorry. Are you still with me? I am not hearing anything.
Yep, still here.
Thank you. So some people are still conscious?
Oh, yeah, this is great.
Yeah,
All
we're
right.
just muted.
All right, thank you. This is the M14 listing. It is insane and pointless to try and translate these prices into modern dollars. I have tried. Everything ends up being in the thousands and thousands. Some of those could be maybe plausibly accurate, but just the worlds are so different that I don't do it. Like I said, this is their first and only condenser microphone at this point. And it's surrounded by all kinds of other equipment. And that's what the Telefunken ELA division was into. There are microphones of much, much lower quality, carbon microphones, a ribbon microphone here, which has a pretty professional price on it. The Neumann mic, and the rest is accessories for that. And whole other categories of sound equipment. Cabinet speakers with amplifiers built in, transformers. For some reason, rectifiers were sold as a separate outboard component. A lot of loudspeakers. And curiously, an electronic instrument for the home that they called a trautonium, a keyboard instrument. This is a somewhat later, still Nazi era price list. And I have to say, again, I know I've had my head buried in a lot of historical stuff, but when I see a right angle figure like this, my mind puts the rest of it in. A lot of these catalogs were printed in brown ink, which was the thematic color of the Nazis as well. Here again, pretty much the same kinds of products as before, but I put this in here because it has nice pictures. And here's the picture of the Neumann mic. The tube was sold separately for 1% of the price of the microphone. And it comes with a fancy little stand that is not included. It's an extra charge for that. And I'm sorry, but I don't know what capsule that is. It matches up with the photos I have for, like from Rössler's book, which might be this thing called the M1-2, but, can't be sure.
What's that little piece on the side?
I have not been able to figure that out unless it's a way that you could plug two contacts into it, but
Okay.
it doesn't make sense because this had the plug for this microphone was something like 6 or 7 contacts, so I do not know what that is. It doesn't have its own separate product listing. So I'm sorry, I've wondered that as well. That's one of my unsolved mysteries. This over here is a one-tube microphone preamp. That's to raise the signals from the condenser or other microphones to the input level needed for a PA system or an amplifier.
I was going to mention that I have the coffee table book of Neumann, so if you have some questions you want to ask about it later, I'll look them up.
Yeah, great.
David,
I have it here too.
Next to that little square box that looks like a power strip, it's got a ELA M14 with an ELA 378.
Yeah, well, the M14 is the microphone.
Yes.
And the other thing is the stand that it's the J78 is the stand that it's sitting on.
Okay.
Okay.
Thanks.
That's your Tisch stand.
Oh yeah, right.
Table stand.
Got it.
Okay. So there's nothing explaining what this is or identifying its part number, if any. It may have been part of the table stand. What's
an Authgen nipple?
That's a hanging device. It's things like that are made today. It's like a threaded coupling that you can put the cable into it and suspend the microphone.
Okay. Thanks.
Yeah. So, they had huge amplifiers, lots and lots of speaker elements. This is you can see a trend in their development of products that they're marketing, because this is for public address systems of considerable size and power. A few of these could fill a stadium is the idea. One of the first big jobs that Telefunken ELA took on after they were founded was the 1936 Olympics in Berlin. They had 11 separate sound systems, and I don't remember if I took my slide at it or not, but this is, they're going for ways to address a large number of people. There was a lot of mass action going on in those days. This is a way of zooming in on the three particular microphones, or the three, if you remember that table from X number of slides ago, where I showed this table on the bottom. These three, the capsules for these three microphones is what I'd like to show you next, because they had an old-fashioned idea about microphone patterns. Okay, this was never referred to as omnidirectional. This is that pressure transducer. And here's its polar diagram. And I've labeled the frequencies. Maybe you can see that a little bit better. And you can see that it's continually narrowing up through the mid-range and up to the high frequency limit of 10 kilohertz. This was called the normal response pattern. That's just the word that you see again and again in this old literature. And it makes sense because this type of a capsule would be great for a lot of different applications, speech as well as music. It would give you focus from a fair distance in a way that a true omnidirectional microphone would not as much. It would also be resistant to handling noise, breath noise, wind noise, the way that an Omni is today compared to a pressure gradient microphone. So I kind of see the charm in this pattern, even though it's not one of our textbook patterns today. And it is the type that you see most often in the old pictures. This is the capsule that came to be called the M7, and that's famous nowadays because it was used in the U-47 and a whole bunch of successors, and it's perhaps the most frequently cloned capsule that there is, or one of the two anyway. And what I'm showing you here is the polar pattern that they published for it. But Telefunken's polar patterns in this period of time were not decibels, they were millivolts. So this is a linear scale, not a log scale. And when you turn this right side up and translate it into modern plotting, this is what Neumann today shows as the polar patterns. They still use, it's the same acoustical design. They put it into different types of screens and head shapes, and the diaphragm material is different nowadays. But it is the same acoustical design, and by and large, this was its polar pattern at different frequencies. So you can see that at any frequency that's off axis, it has a very different frequency response from what it has on axis, and different angles are different from each other. And this was, people built their entire technique of recording around it. So I'm not knocking it, but it is very particularly what it is. And it is, to my mind, the highest, the upper mid-range and mid-range is a supercardioid, not a cardioid, whereas the bottom end is what we would call a wide cardioid today. And you can find a frequency at which it's more or less a cardioid, but that depends on trying different frequencies. This is their figure 8, and it's actually pretty good. It just doesn't have quite the same sensitivity in front and back. And they didn't have control over that very much. It's a single diaphragm. Oh yeah, the peculiar thing that might be counterintuitive is that this ostensibly cardioid microphone was a double diaphragm design, whereas the pattern that has the two sensitivity lobes, front and back, is a single diaphragm design. It's just suspended in a way so that sound can reach it in the front and the back in opposite polarity. For its time, this is pretty good, but we're always talking about an upper limit of 10 kilohertz here, especially for the figure eight. Figure eights roll off sooner than a bunch of other patterns. Okay, here are the two authors, the two researchers. They worked for the Rundfunkgesellschaft, the official government agency that supervised broadcasting. And they are best known for having invented AC bias for tape recording, which turned tape recorders into high fidelity instruments for the first time. But they had worked out also how to build pressure gradient microphone capsules with somewhat controllable directional patterns, and they patented it. And so I have seen repeated, I have to put this on the level of rumor, I have seen repeatedly that they were the actual designers of Neumann's M7 and M8 capsules, and they did hold the patent on them. So at the very least, Neumann would have had to license the technology. But I've never actually seen absolutely direct confirmation of what the business arrangement was, so I don't want to make a statement about it, except that there must have been some business arrangement. Their book goes through the fundamentals of condenser microphones. They called them capacitive microphones. And here they're using a Neumann microphone with a Telefunken badge on it as their photograph example of a microphone. You can see the torpedo shape here. Okay, that's what it refers to. This was on a little swivel. You could bend it up or down to a small range of angles. And this is the diffuse field response of the, where's my cursor? This is the diffuse field response of the pressure transducer, and this is its polar response just at low and high frequencies. And these are the pages where they gave the basic principles of their patents. It's 2 patents in Germany and 1 in America, so I don't know whether to talk about it as plural or singular, but this explains basically the operating principles, which were not generally known at the time. Okay, just to give you some more pictures, again, okay, this is 1939. By this point, the second version of the amplifier has been introduced, the one with the tall stalk between the amplifier and the capsules, which was used for the 2 directional capsules. And this is still using the older model amplifier for the pressure transducer, because it doesn't really care as much about the proximity of a large object. And here is one photo that shows both of the other 2. This is with the long neck. And in this little notch, you could see a picture that represented graphically what the pattern of the capsule was, a cardioid or a figure eight. Actually, Germans don't call a cardioid a cardioid. Cardioid means heart-shaped. They call them kidneyoid, Niere. It just looks like a sideways kidney to them, I guess. Here are those, and these are battery power supplies for the microphones. One made of wood, one made of metal with a battery level meter on it, and they took a 100-volt battery. And these show the goosenecks that could be put between the amplifier and the capsule, and a little raincoat for the capsule for all-weather outdoor use. Again, Nazis were really big on huge outdoor rallies. These are just selected pages from the catalog. There's a lot of pages. These are, I just wanted to point out in the weight column here, this is 360 kilograms for a 1,000 watt amplifier. That's what, about 900 pounds, 800? Yes, 800, just under 800. Loudspeakers, loudspeakers, loudspeakers. A control desk with a turntable in it and a loudspeaker. And are you able to see the nice little emblem in a wreath that my cursor is pointing to? There's a swastika engraved on it.
I can see why this was really difficult for you, David. Thank you for doing this.
Yeah.
I mean, I could say it is what it is, but what it is too much. Again, this shows a practical application that was very relevant at the time. Sound trucks for announcing when you should all gather in the town square to watch people being beaten up and degraded, or, to hear the latest announcement. The one piece from the history page that I want to point out is, in World War I, at the end of the war, there were local revolutions, partly protesting the war, but partly protesting the Kaiser's government. And some of them were communist inspired, some were socialist, some were just democratically oriented. The Kaiser resigned and the Weimar Republic was established, but the whole right wing of German society was never in favor of democracy. And due to this change of government, and partly, well, it's complicated, the German military signed a military surrender that the people never expressed themselves about. And part of the terms of surrender that were eventually worked out, the Treaty of Versailles, was an almost total demilitarization of a society that had been deeply militaristic for decades. And a very, very large armed force was thrown out of work. And many of them felt that their government, or their new government, was made of exactly the people that had betrayed them, stabbed them in the back, they said, and pooled a German defeat from when they thought they could have achieved victory. And the right-wing parties, especially the Nazis, were able to attract a very large number of these people into a kind of paramilitary, well, there were several paramilitary organizations, but mostly the SA, which ended up in short order being larger than the combined military and police forces of all of Germany. And the Nazis used to set them loose to wreak all kinds of violence on civilians that they wanted to bring under control. So that's, I'm sorry, that's kind of traumatic stuff, but I don't know how many people maintain an awareness of it. And I do have a wish that people would be aware of it. So now I've said my piece.
And thank you. Thank you for that.
Yeah.
Definitely. Never forget.
Now, just because I'm a somewhat German-speaking person who deals with Schoeps, I don't want my attitude to be misunderstood. I'm also a Jewish American. Here I just wanted to show some of the interesting addresses where Telefunken had their offices. Can you read that from with the screen size you have? I don't know.
Yes,
Yes.
yes.
Okay.
Oh my
Yes,
God.
right. Streets were renamed all the time
Ugh.
for political reasons.
In the patent thing that you showed earlier, the one of the words was Reich Company or something like that.
Yes, Reichspatent, but
Yes.
that's not
Fair.
Nazi.
Okay.
The
You went too far, I think.
No, I think the Neumann patent is earlier. Here, right? Reichspatentamt is the
Oh,
Imperial
right.
Patent Office.
It was also on the book that you showed.
Right.
The two guys'
No,
book.
this is Weimar Republic, and
Oh.
Deutsches Reich was also the term that the Weimar Republic used,
Oh.
even though it was a republic and not a monarchy. They inherited the symbols and the terminology of the Kaiser period, the Second Reich. The Nazis
Right.
were the third, right?
That makes sense.
Yeah, so this is still, because if this had been Nazi, you would have seen a swastika underneath the tail of the eagle. And I think I'm going to be showing you a patent later on where you can see that there used to be a swastika there.
Okay.
Okay, that was also true for buildings in Germany because they had the eagles on them with swastikas, and then after the war they had to take the swastikas off. But in a lot of parts of Germany, particularly in Bavaria, you can still today see buildings with eagles on them, and there's some broken piece of stone at the bottom of the eagle.
Right there.
And you just know that used to be a swastika.
Okay.
Okay. Things get a little, okay, I'm not able to keep things in historical order from here on for various reasons, because I want to follow the technology maybe more than the history. But again, the end of World War II was very different from the end of World War I. I told you how the end of World War I, the people in the German army, by and large, were very bitter about the way that things ended. In World War II, it is really clear that they had been defeated on both fronts. Okay, Russia, the Red Army pushed into from the east, and the Americans from the west. There was this enormous Allied bombing campaign that is maybe not talked about as much as it should be, because it was cities that were bombed, civilian population centers. We did that.
Right. Wasn't that firebombing too?
Dresden was firebombed. A couple other cities were firebombed, meaning that the bombing sucked all the oxygen out of the air and people died from suffocation, even if they hadn't been impacted by the bombs. The major cities all through Germany and a lot of in-between cities were rubble. Housing stock was destroyed as much as industrial. It was a time of poverty for almost everybody except the very, very rich, who, as usual, were comfortable. The Allies initially were unified and issued orders that forbade any technological development that had a war purpose to it or an ostensible war purpose to it. Which so what I'm saying is that there was a real understanding among the Germans that they had lost, very different from World War I. And there are historians today who kind of group the two world wars together into one big world war with an interim period, and this is when it really ended, really, really finally, for Germany. It actually went on for several years in Eastern Europe, which is another thing I never remember hearing about in history class, is that as late as 53 and 54 in Eastern European countries, the war was continuing in various guises. But in Germany, all the engineers and scientists who had worked on wartime projects suddenly had to find peacetime work, and so there was an immense amount of talent suddenly available for peaceable uses of technology. And the government of Germany had a real interest in employing those people, in giving them, useful employment. So that's one reason things got as high tech and as high quality as it did. AM broadcasting and I think also long wave started up pretty soon under Allied supervision. FM had been invented but not implemented, and television had been invented and to some extent implemented during the war, but it needed to be re-established and made a public thing. Neumann had a factory in Berlin. During the later part of the war, that's when the bombing was most intense, his factory was destroyed. So he had already set up the Gefell factory, which is in Berlin, is in the eastern part of Germany, and so is Gefell, south of there. Neumann himself was in France. He kept himself busy developing what for a lot of people is his most important invention, which is rechargeable batteries, gas-tight sealed rechargeable batteries. Then there was a kind of last-minute shuffle in the negotiations at the Potsdam conference, and Gefell, where Neumann's factory was, fell into the zone that was going to be under Soviet occupation, and he didn't want that. There was again still even a moderately conservative German would have had a lot of suspicion of the Soviet Union. Of course, a true Nazi would have thought of it in terms of what they call Judeo-Bolshevism, because Hitler always associated Judaism with communism, made up combined words like that. But I don't think Neumann was necessarily like that, but it was at least uneasy, I think, with having a factory in the Soviet zone only. So he set up an additional factory in Berlin, and for a while, the two of them were in some correspondence. This is the first microphone product. He was also still concerned with disc cutting equipment and some other things. But this is, of course, the most famous microphone Neumann ever produced. It is not a new capsule design. This is, again, Bauen, Mühl, and Weber's capsule design that came about through whatever business arrangement, I don't know, that I talked about earlier. But it's got a somewhat more compact model, and it has, for the first time, a switchable pattern because, as I said, the capsule had two diaphragms, and if you energize them both and sum their signals, then you get a kind of a quasi-omni pattern, although it still has all the problems of a pressure gradient as far as handling noise and breath noise and things like that, but it's still useful in a lot of situations. And this is the sort of resurrected post-war Telefunken. One of their publications, this is not a complete catalog, it's a kind of a list that they put out once or twice a year to show their leading products. And it's a diverse range selection, but you see the U47 in here kind of marooned among crystal microphones. This is a dynamic microphone. This is a close talking communications microphone. This is a tape recorder for domestic use, several different kinds of amplifiers, a portable mixer, mic mixer. It's still their only condenser microphone, and it's still kind of overwhelmed by everything else that Telefunken is selling. Okay, this is a bit of a backstep historically. I've already told you most of it. The ARD is the name of the kind of central administrative body, though the broadcasting was regional in content. The Nazis, of course, were able to step in and take it over completely and instantly, and they put it under the Ministry of Propaganda. The fact that it was centrally organized made it super easy for them. They just fired all the liberals and replaced them with Nazis, and they had a propaganda network instantly ready for them. When that was re-decentralized after the war, the ARD still existed as an administrative body, and they were the ones who published at first the Brown books, and then that got handed over. Wait, okay, I'm leaving out a step. There was maybe I should though, because I'm taking a lot of time. There was a particular broadcaster called the NWDR, the Nordwestdeutsche Rundfunk, in the Frankfurt area. And they had the most advanced laboratory, and their technology developed like the M49 and M50, if you're into old Neumanns, were actually invented at the NWDR. The head of the laboratory was Dr. Herbert Großkopf, who patented the technology behind those microphones. They were then licensed for manufacture to Neumann. Neumann did not invent them. But the NWDR was split into two other stations in 1956, and the Institute for Rundfunktechnik, the IRT, was created, and that then became the central laboratory for German broadcasting technology. By then, television was very much in the picture as well. And just to show you something about that laboratory, their publications were their test reports on the equipment. They used to review and test all the equipment that any broadcasting station might want to purchase. And they had excellent laboratories. And very often when the manufacturers saw what the IRT's laboratories measured about their equipment, they would hurriedly improve their equipment and submit it for retesting. And this is an example of a well-regarded condenser microphone that I will not name, but people who delve in these old catalogs might recognize the curve. And this is the manufacturer's published frequency response curve. This is what the IRT found for the same microphone. And I have used this microphone, and to me it sounds like this curve. I used it a lot actually at one point. This is a polar diagram drawn at 6 different frequencies from a measuring distance of 1 meter, which is the operative standard, although it's not the legal standard. Sort of strange thing we could get into. And this was a modern capsule. This is not one of those old, this isn't the M7, but this was sold as a cardioid, the cardioid setting of a multi-pattern capsule, dual diaphragm capsule. And this is what the IRT measured for its actual directional response as a cardioid, which doesn't look like a cardioid to me. But it's a very successful microphone from a major manufacturer.
Why is it non-symmetrical left to right?
Because they have mapped some of the frequencies on one side and some on the other.
Okay.
Right? Because if you were to take this curve and continue it over here, it would just be the mirror image of the same curve.
Okay, good.
So and then you'd have to have 6 separate curves here, and they'd overlap and get confusing. Right? But this way, they can take 3 different curve drawing symbols, and it isn't as confusing.
Good.
Yeah, that's pretty conventional practice.
Yeah, I just can't see it quite well enough resolution to tell what.
I'm sorry.
No, it's fine. It's not you at all. Thanks.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Yeah, the low frequency, the lower and mid, everything up to 1 kilohertz is on the left. Everything 4 kilohertz and above is on the right in this. That's why you see it getting narrow at the highest frequencies, and it's very broad at the bottom. That's typical of dual diaphragm cardioids, is that they become more and more omnidirectional at lower and lower frequencies.
Got it.
Okay, so the second manufacturer that Telefunken ELA included was Schoeps. Their actual company name was Schalltechnik this is the name of his degree, his college degree. It's a Doctor of Engineering, Karl Schoeps. And everything in yellow was their formally registered corporate name, which is a mouthful. I mean, I don't even know how to say the degree out loud, but there it is. And this is not their first model of microphone, but it's the first one that received an illustrated brochure from Telefunken, so that's why I'm showing it here. It's the M201, which I think some of you know because it was used in the Mercury Living Presence series, and I understand that Tom Fine gave a talk recently, so he probably mentioned them. I wish I had heard that, but I'll catch up on it later.
Yes, you can see the video now. I'll put the link in the chat.
Hooray. I really look forward to that. He's a great guy and he knows a lot. This is the first microphone that Schoeps actually manufactured, although it's got that same capsule as you saw on the M201, and that is not the original capsule for this model. I don't have any photographs of this type of microphone with the original capsule on it, and that's something I want to fix the next time I'm able to get back to Germany. Schoeps was founded in '48, so that's part of the answer. They did not make microphones right away. They spent a couple of years rebuilding bombed out auditoriums and movie theaters and installing sound systems in them. They made 12 tape recorders. They bought the mechanisms. It's not that they had to invent all that. It was actually possible to buy those from a third-party supplier, but they made all the electronics for them. And one of them was stereo, which amazes me. They also made a sphere stereo microphone in 1948 or 49, which I know because of a long explanation I can give you. And Dr. Schoeps recorded stereo tapes, which unfortunately somebody from the factory gave away, which irritates me no end as an amateur historian. Anyway, they went a slightly different route than Neumann. Neumann started with large diaphragm pressure transducers. By this time, decades later, Schoeps wanted to address the 10 kilohertz limitation, which wasn't like a hard limitation. The microphones did go to higher frequencies, but they were down by the top end. And FM radio technology was clearly on its way in, and Dr. Schoeps was, and actually especially Dr. Küsters, I've put his name in the emphatic color because he was the real inventor, to my mind, in the sense of he's the one who built the things, tested them, did the calculations, threw away the things that didn't work, kept the notes. Dr. Schoeps was kind of the ideas guy, and he did the schmoozing. He talked with potential investors. He's the one who arranged the loan from the state government that made it possible for them to move into a factory. They had been working in his attic apartment before then. But from all that I've been able to see, I mean, Dr. Küsters is the one who should maybe be given more credit as far as the quality of the product in the early years. So I would like him to be unforgotten if possible. Just as I'm going to mention somebody later who I would like to be unforgotten, which is Albert Hiller. Anyway, they developed a small Omni capsule with pretty flat range up to 19 kilohertz. And by getting the membrane very, very close to the backplate, they were able to make its sensitivity equivalent to that of a large diaphragm capsule. So its dynamic range was also roughly equivalent. And this was the first time that with available vacuum tube technology, you could get a decent signal to noise ratio from a small diaphragm capsule. So they made about 24 or 20 huge bottle microphones using this tiny, tiny capsule. It looks like Zippy the Pinhead. It's a sort of ridiculous creation. They lent them out to various people to try just to generate buzz. And then they settled on a business model where they would make capsules and send them to a supplier in Zurich, Switzerland, who was going to build the amplifiers, the power supplies, the cables, package everything up, market it, and sell it as complete sets. And they sent that company, it was named Telemex, 20 sample capsules to begin their work with. And when Telemex sent Schoeps back a set of their power supply and amplifier, Schoeps found it unacceptable and decided, okay, if we have to make our own, we will. They canceled the deal with Telemex, and they became a sort of full vertically integrated supplier of complete microphones, which they had never intended to be. They also worked out a way of producing a cardioid pattern from a pair of small diaphragm capsules. And here again, this is a close-up of 3 of that same capsule head that you saw on the M201s. It was really first invented for this type of microphone here, the CM51/3. And you can see, if you look behind the gauze, can you see a circular thing there and another circular thing here?
Yes.
Is that visible?
Yep.
Okay. The lower thing is a pressure transducer, small omni capsule. The upper thing is a figure 8 capsule, a pure pressure gradient. And built into the neck of this thing is a mechanical switch. So if you extended the neck, then it would cut off the signal to and from the figure 8 capsule. But if you scrunched the top of the capsule downward toward the bottom, the base, it would connect both capsules. And when you combine a figure 8 with an omni of equal sensitivity, what you get is a cardioid. And this was a really a decent cardioid. It had broad rejection of signals from behind it up to pretty high frequencies for its time. There was no single diaphragm cardioid capsule at this time. Hadn't been invented yet. The idea of a time delay behind the back plate and so on. How they got out of the laboratory and into business was not with German broadcasting, but with French. Dr. Schoeps had a buddy, Colonel Dordilly, who had connections with French radio. And French broadcasting was more centralized than German was. They actually had a central office in Paris that directed all the regional stations. They did all the purchasing from a central point in Paris. And Dr. Schoeps sent 2 sample microphones of the type we saw earlier. It's the same amplifier, but they're small omni capsule that I guess I didn't put any pictures of that into the slideshow. To Paris, and the engineers tried it out with a small orchestra and speaking voices and a radio drama and some things, and they decided that they had to have it. And not only did they have to have it, they had to equip every single one of their stations in the entire network with those microphones. Again, this was in anticipation of starting FM broadcasting. So this put Schoeps into a good business position for the first time. They had been living on a shoestring and on borrowed money all this time. And Telefunken caught wind of the deal with French radio and said, can we represent you in the rest of the world? Because Schoeps was going to deal directly with France, or actually through a specially appointed representative who was dealing for them in France. But the French radio remained their biggest single customer for 15 years, something like that. That's one of the things I need to establish more definitely, but it was still a huge factor by 1970. I know that for sure. And again, here this shows the company logo. Oh yeah, this is where I have to explain about what Schoeps did. Schoeps's contract with Telefunken, I've been able to see the terms that it had because there's a state archive in Baden-Württemberg, which is the state that Karlsruhe is in now, that preserved the documentation from the government loans that Dr. Schoeps took out. And he had to file reports on what he was doing, and third parties had to audit his books and, visit his factory and see everything, report on it. So he wanted the contract with Telefunken. He knew that he was an unknown, and he wanted to become known. And he observed that Neumann wasn't allowed to put their own insignia on their mics. If you looked at the very top of the directional capsule heads of a Neumann microphone, bottle microphone, you'd see a tiny little N in a circle, which was their insignia. But the name Neumann was nowhere on the microphone and nowhere in the sales literature from Telefunken. So Dr. Schoeps insisted on a provision in the contract that he would be allowed to put his company name and insignia on the back of the microphones. The thing is that his company name primarily was Schalltechnik, which is an obscure name for anybody who doesn't speak German. It means like sound system technology. Schallwellen is sound waves in German. And this symbol, if you see it down in the lower right corner, is a T, is a wavy, like an oscilloscope sine wave, representing the S in Schalltechnik, and the T is the technic part. This doesn't make sense, intuitive sense to most people, but this was going to be his vehicle for making himself famous. I can't say that it was all that directly successful. And I just put in the bottom right, his executive secretary was a woman named Ingeborg Spohn, whom I knew. She's actually still alive. I shouldn't put her in past tense. And she had to answer the phone all day, Schalltechnik Dr. Schoeps, guten Tag, which gets, I think, really tiresome after you've said it a few times.
Awesome.
Very dear lady. These are the first two illustrated brochures that Telefunken put out, and you can see one of the other provisions that Dr. Schoeps got in his contract was that all advertising and all technical literature concerning his products would have his name on it. So Telefunken did that for the first time for Schoeps, and then instantly you see the same thing on Neumann's brochures. They seem to have insisted on the same consideration.
What year is this, David?
53-ish.
Great. Thanks.
The microphones were actually introduced in 52, but the brochures, I think, are from slightly later. And this is, again, I told you, they published these lists of their primary equipment, not an exhaustive list. And I think it was always possible, if you were dealing with Telefunken, especially after the war, that anybody that they represented for any product, you could also get the other products of that same company through Telefunken if you wanted to, if you knew about them. But this is, again, their list of their primary equipment, most popular items, most interesting or popular items. And you see the U47 up against the M200 and 201. Can you see the prices?
Yes,
Right?
710 Deutschmarks,
For
that
the
one.
U47, okay. And the Schoeps mics were more expensive. They were the high-priced brand. The markup for Telefunken was something like 100%. This was an extremely profitable, low-ish volume business for them. It's one reason that they never got into producing microphones themselves. And first of all, these weren't capable of being mass-produced. The kind of labor that it takes to make microphones on this level of quality is an extensive amount of hand work, hand labor, skilled hand labor, and it doesn't scale. Like if you suddenly need twice as many microphones, then you need twice as long to produce them. You can't just ramp up because it might take 6 months to train somebody to make a capsule. Anyway, it wasn't the kind of business that either AEG or Siemens wanted to get into. They would still rather build something that weighed 100 tons and would make them $1 million per sale. All right, in foreign countries, Telefunken sometimes had its own offices, but more often they contracted out their own representation to local representatives of Telefunken. And in the United States, the main one, although evidently not the exclusive one, was a company called American Elite with headquarters in New York City. And this is a flyer, a fold-out, 4-page fold-out. The back page isn't technically so interesting. That again shows the M201 up against the U47. And there is, again, a similar price disparity. The M201 is the more expensive mic. The U47 was selling in higher volume, clearly. But and Dan, you had asked me what the present dollar values of these were. It's
Yes.
about 9 times as much.
Great, thank you. That's interesting.
Depending on whether you take this to be okay, that's based on consumer price index inflation, and I'm not sure that that's really appropriate, but that's the easiest thing to find. So that means that the U47 would be, the selling price would be equivalent to about $3,800 today, and that the M201 selling price would be equivalent to about $4,750 today. But that's that could be off by a factor of 2, depending on how you chart inflation. What I also want to show you is this cable. This was the cable that went between the M200 or M201 and its power supply. And this pod in line in the cable had the output transformer. So if you open up one of these amplifier bodies, 9/10 of it is the vacuum tube. It's got a 6AU6 or an EF94 in there, socketed, and very, very little else. A couple of resistors and capacitors, but only the stuff that absolutely needed to be next to the capsule for reasons of avoiding signal losses. And there was a couple feet of cable between the tube and the output transformer that was located here with a couple of other components in it. And then here was the power supply.
I was going to mention that's similar to the Altec M11 that was an omnidirectional, but they didn't have any transformer in their body at all.
Mm-hmm. I guess I just want to warn you, if you look on eBay, anytime somebody's selling an M200 or 201, 9 times out of 10 they don't have this cable. I mean, you can make another transformer, but transformers are kind of important. They're kind of critical to the sound quality. So I think it's a shame. What I'd like to do is maybe, if I can, I'll try to find out what the specifications of the transformer were and anything technical about it, and I'll try to get Schoeps to agree to have that made public, because people are sort of in the dark trying to figure out what the actual characteristics of these mics were supposed to be.
Cool.
Right, this is just a slightly later version of the same type of list. Telefunken still uses this column loudspeaker as their emblem. And you see here a mix of Tauchspulmikrofon is a dynamic mic. That's a Bayer. They also had some that were ELA MD, which is Sennheiser. They didn't follow the ELA M code all the time with dynamic mics, but they did. Well, here's where we see the first big deviation beside the U47 itself. But here are the small Neumanns for the first time, which were mostly introduced because of the growth of television. Something that wouldn't create a big shadow, and also FM because they had more linear high frequency response than the large diaphragm microphones. Last major topic I want to bring in is the AC701, because this is like a different aspect of the relationship between Telefunken and the manufacturers. And I haven't mentioned AKG yet because they were only distributing dynamics, and AKG condensers come in later. Telefunken definitely did make vacuum tubes, big time. They had for decades. A company in, where was it? I'll think of it in a moment, but Albert Hiller, KG, started hand making glass tubes for use in small microphones. His company actually made small microphones as well. The guy, I think, really deserves a lot more acknowledgement than he gets. But he had a high-tech vacuum technology plant, small, but real. And he was able to make vacuum tubes. And the first relatively well-known tube that he made is called the MSC2. And again, people who are old Neumann freaks will recognize that the original versions of the M49 and M50 used the MSC2. Schoeps also used it for a model called the C55R that nobody knows about, but I've seen one picture of one of them. I mean, they didn't even know about it at Schoeps, except I found some paperwork for it. Hiller's next model was the MSC4, and that was a mere 16 millimeters in diameter and was the quietest, lowest distortion, lowest microphonics, high impedance, high isolation vacuum tube ever designed, and one of the only ones ever designed specifically for the application of being put into a condenser microphone. And Hiller was the pioneer of that. And so the German broadcasting, the ARD, arranged for this to be transferred over to Telefunken, for Telefunken to start actually serially producing it. And this turned out to be extraordinarily difficult for them. It was over a decade before they were able to put it into real quantity production, and until then, they had it in their sort of experimental, or in the beginning years, manual production line, what they call the null series. What you can see in this picture, if you don't have something blocking it, is that there's a little ring at the top of the microphone envelope, and there's a wire coming out of it. That is the grid attachment. That goes through one component, usually, to the capsule itself. And this is a Schoeps mic that was built around that. And the other contacts on the tube were also wires. That was true of the predecessor tube as well. This was not a tube with pins that could fit into a socket. And that was the sort of bane of its existence in a way. because in order to put this into a microphone, or in order to test a tube to make sure that it was quiet and hadn't leaked gas or whatever, you had to solder it into a circuit. And the soldering required heat sinks and a special fine-tipped soldering iron and real skill, and you had to do it in a damn hurry before the heat started damaging the elements of the tube. This is one reason why, especially American studio managers, demanded that different tubes be used in their microphones, and why both Schoeps and Neumann, and to some extent AKG, had to produce alternate versions of their microphones that didn't use that tube, even though that tube was better from every audio standpoint. So the German broadcasters, which, as I said, was a big purchasing group and had a lot of clout, built a set of standards around this tube, including an exact standard for how the shielding and grounding should be wired in a microphone that used the tube, and in all the cables and power supplies that worked with this tube. And they wanted the broadcasting stations to use only microphones that used this tube until the 1960s, when solid-state microphones started to be used. So all three, Schoeps, Neumann, and AKG, all made microphones with it. I list some of the model numbers here. That's actually most of them. And this is some correspondence. I don't know. This has to do with the travails at Telefunken. The fact that, first of all, it was just difficult for them to produce the tube in the first place. The design of the tube is, it's fine for a small scale company that can take hours of manual labor to put them together, but not so much for a company that's trying to hurry things along. And it talks about the reject rate down here. They said up to now, and this is 66. Okay, so that's 13 years later, and they're still about to turn this over for mass production. And if you know your history, by 66, there are starting to be solid-state microphones with low-noise silicon FETs in them. But they said this was about the struggle that they had to get the reject rate down from 30% to 3%. And the way that they did this was to take the actual microphone circuit from the one of the three companies that returned the most microphones percentage-wise, and they actually built that circuit on a breadboard, and they wired every single AC701 into that circuit and measured its noise and distortion, and then desoldered it and put it into the, if it passed the test, then they put it into the carton and shipped it. And that brought their reject rate down to only 3%. But even so, this was a troublesome creature for them. I have these two letters, courtesy of a gentleman who has passed away, and I would like to mention his name, is Oliver Arkhut, who was, some people will know because he wound transformers and was a very helpful person to anybody who was trying to deal with vintage equipment. He actually had worked at Telefunken as a young man and was there when they went out of business. And he maintained ties with some of the old timers and interviewed them and learned what he could. And he rescued a bunch of documents from the trash bin when they were, wholesale just disposing of them. And he plays another part in the story later on, but I did want to mention him. He's just a very positive person with I enjoyed talking with him. So I think everybody did. All right, so the AC701, clearly the best tube from a technical standpoint and a sonic standpoint that had ever been put into a microphone. But it was only made by one company, which was a strike against it for a lot of business-oriented people over here. And as I said, you couldn't exchange it just by pulling it out of a socket and putting another one in. You had to have all the special soldering equipment and skills and heat sinks and the time to do it. And you couldn't put fingerprints on it, or else, it might add noise. And it was a pain to deal with. Fortunately, it didn't need to be replaced that often unless a leak developed and it went bad. An AC701 that isn't like dropped or messed with can last 30 or 40 years and still be quiet and still be good sounding. But they didn't know that back then. And there were American studio managers who thought they would be ahead of the maintenance game by replacing the tubes in all of their microphones every year or two, no matter whether they needed it or not. So tubes like the VF-14, which wasn't manufactured after the war. I'm sorry, that's not true. I take that back. Which was an earlier design, but came to be used only for this one purpose and then became rare. Let's put it that way. Those studio managers, I think some of them later regretted it, that they had thrown away perfectly good VF-14s that sell for in the 4 figures now. But there was pressure on the manufacturers to offer microphones with socketed tubes that were as good as you could get with that. Neumann, the KM64 was a big seller. They made an alternate model that used an RCA Nuvistor, which is another type of sub-miniature tube, low voltage tube. Schoeps didn't want to do that. AKG did as well. They used Nuvistors. Schoeps happened to decide that they would fall back on the 6AU6 or the EF94 that they were familiar with. And so their microphones were larger. If you wanted a socketed tube, you had a 25 millimeter diameter microphone instead of 20. And since they were using basically the same capsule design in a larger housing, the polar patterns weren't quite as good and the high frequency response wasn't quite as good. So if you really wanted the high quality Schoeps, you got an M221 of some sort, whereas if you wanted the socketed tubes, you got these other types, the CM61 and CM60. By the way, that is the correct order. The CM61 was introduced first, and then the CM60 was its successor, and that's one of the joys of dealing with Schoeps' history is their product naming conventions. All right, here's where the discussion started at the last meeting, and I'll be done soon. The contracts with, if not, I don't know for a fact what kind of contract Neumann had with Telefunken, but I do know what Schoeps had. And it was automatically self-renewing. And if you gave them 6 months notice, then you could not renew it or you could renegotiate the terms of it. And I gather that Neumann renegotiated the terms rather than canceling the contract. And so I think that's a correction I would like to make to the most common narrative that I see on the web about what happened. Because what we're going to see is that Telefunken still represented Neumann in a lot of places and in all of their literature going well into the 60s. But in the United States, at least, Gotham Audio Sales Corporation, led by Stephen Temmer, negotiated a representation that gave them the right to the Neumann trademark in this country. And that's an interesting decision because it gave Gotham Audio the right to tell U.S. Customs not to allow any other importation of any product with a Neumann brand on it, which they did. They aggressively pushed for confiscation of any gray market imports. They said that they were the sole U.S. representative. I would like to see that in print. I mean, I'd like to see the contract before I completely accept that, because there's a funny other thing that went on in an overlapping period of time, and I don't know how it happened, so I don't know exactly what it means. Neumann didn't just make this kind of an agreement with Gotham, but also with other companies in other countries. And I think it worked to their benefit. They were able to imprint their brand onto people somewhat better. I think it is, I feel a real empathy for them, that there are so many people who still think of Neumann microphones as Telefunken, as I do, of course, for Schoeps, but I understand that Neumann deserved to be known as Neumann, that they accomplished a great deal both technically and in every other respect, service, just their general honorability as a company. Plus, Telefunken's markups were insane, at least where Schoeps was concerned, and I suspect that it was similar for Neumann. When Neumann, but there's no doubt that this deprived Telefunken of a substantial amount of sales and profit. They still were the legal representatives of Neumann, apparently, because if you look at all Telefunken catalogs and listings continuing for many years after this, you still see Neumann microphones with Telefunken badges. But specifically, the one thing that seems to have bothered them, and that's my surmise, is the U47. U47 by then had a companion model. By then, had a companion model U48, which had a different pair of patterns. It had cardioid and figure 8 rather than cardioid and omni. What Telefunken, and in the meantime, Telefunken had, AKG had introduced the C12. Telefunken wasn't actively representing any of AKG's condenser mics, but they were aware of them. They may even have sold them on special order, I don't know. They asked AKG to design a microphone that could be the sort of, what do you call that in front of a ship? It's like the figurehead microphone for Telefunken studio sales that incorporated flagship. Thank you very much. You can see I didn't expect the talk to be this long, and I'm losing energy somewhat, but I'll get through this.
You're doing great.
Thank you. So they took the C12 capsule and the AC701 tube, because this was Telefunken, and put them into a body that was smaller in diameter than the U47, so a little easier to handle and less prone to interfere with the acoustics of the capsule, because a big body in a pressure gradient capsule is trouble. These were given Telefunken ELA M numbers. AKG did not market them directly, as far as I know, which makes them somewhat unique, or perhaps altogether unique, in the set of condenser microphones sold by Telefunken, because normally what you had was, like Schoeps was selling their microphones in France, and if you went to the factory, you could pick one up there and pay them for it. Otherwise, you got it through Telefunken with a Telefunken badge, but it was the same microphone. But I don't know for a fact that anybody ever was able to buy an M250 or a 251 from AKG with an AKG emblem on it. I have seen photos of such microphones, but I don't know whether they were reconstructions or not. And so there are people who go so far as to say that Telefunken designed these microphones simply because their logo is on them and you don't see them with an AKG logo, but I don't think that follows. And also for the US market, there were the same kind of parallel alternate model with a socketed tube, which I believe, I mean, I haven't worked with these microphones. They're out of my price class. Plus, I don't generally work with large diaphragm microphones in the type of recording that I do, which is live concert recording. But it's my intuition and understanding that with a different tube in them, they might have sounded somewhat different. But they have the E on the end for export, and that's where these famous microphones got their origin. Again, I would advocate their being acknowledged as AKG microphones rather than Telefunken. I don't quite see the point of glorifying the distributor. This is a Telefunken. Telefunken put out a quarterly magazine, and this is their introduction of these two microphones. The most notable thing about it, first of all, is that the only reference it has to the U47 is that it says this is smaller than the U47. And it has a photograph here that I'm sorry I don't have an easy way to blow up for you without losing the presentation, but it shows that the microphones could be disassembled without tools down to a certain point. The amplifier with the tube and associated components was in a little module package of its own. And so it was very easy for, say, a larger studio to keep some spare parts on hand, and they could get one of these microphones up and working in almost no time if something went wrong with it. And then they could send the defective module back for service to Telefunken, which of course would then send it to AKG, which would send it back to Telefunken, which would send it back to the studio. Oh, that was the thing I didn't mention about the Schoeps contract. Schoeps was required that if anybody wrote to them directly, hoping to buy their microphones, that they had to turn that correspondence over to Telefunken. And Telefunken was required to ship all service items to Schoeps. So everything that went through Telefunken as a distributor had extra shipping time and settling time just because of that three-party arrangement. And it's again one reason I think in favor of Neumann's deal with Gotham Audio and Bouch and the other national representatives that they had, which was that there could be competent local service in a way that Telefunken did not support. So that the changeover to Gotham Audio and the like was 57-ish. 57 is when they notified not to renew. 58 is when they started representing Neumann. 59, Neumann got a communication from Telefunken saying, by the way, you are the only people to whom we are selling the tube that's used in the U47 and 48 anymore, and we want to discontinue it. So Neumann, rather than looking for a different tube or a different circuitry generally, decided that they would discontinue the capsules as well as the microphones, as the amplifiers, and make a more modern product. The following year, they introduced the U67. It was originally going to be named U60 after the year. You'll notice a lot of their model names are the year that the microphone was introduced or was expected to be introduced, although they didn't always make it in time. That happened to Schoeps as well. So the U60 was began to be sold, and then they said, since this is going to replace the U47, let's take advantage of the association people have in their minds with the number 47 and call it the U67 instead. So since the U47 was discontinued, And Telefunken was representing the U67 in all the contexts, whatever those were, where they were allowed to sell Neumann microphones, of course with a Telefunken label. They really didn't have much need for the AKG mics anymore. Now, I don't know what went on here and would love to know if anybody knows. But in all the listings I've seen, and I have consecutive listings for Telefunken for all these years, the AKG mics, the 250 and 251, were only listed in 4 years, 59 through 62. And after that, it's everything else. Schoeps had multi-pattern microphones by then, and Schoeps became more important to Telefunken. But also, the Neumann microphones were listed there, including the U67. By the way, it's obvious if you look closely that this Telefunken label has been dropped into the picture. That's not a photograph of a Telefunken U67. Getting very near the end, I'm just showing you some American literature for Telefunken. American Elite, as I said, was the main representative of Telefunken. And this shows what they call their professional microphones, although it includes a number of dynamic mics that I am not entirely sure I would call professional, except that they are in terms of the distribution channel and the service channel. So yeah, and the standards they followed, the connectors and the fact that they had balanced outputs, but they weren't your prime studio microphone. And they had, again, with Telefunken labels on everything, they had AKG mics. This is a very pretty AKG small diaphragm mic. They had Schoeps. This is the 2 different generations of the M221 series. These were never made at the same time, so I'm not quite sure why they put the pictures in the same flyer. And this is one panel from the brochure, and I just have it here because I admire this as a piece of aggressive sales writing about how wonderful Telefunken is as a company and as a brand, and how every product, the highest standard is, I'm reading from the bottom here, at Telefunken's 18 factories in West Germany with 35,000 employees, where the highest standard is a basic requirement, the same responsible quality control and craftsmanship which produces world-renowned professional studio equipment creates every component which bears the dynamic name Telefunken. And that doesn't include anything in any of the pictures in this entire brochure because none of them were made by Telefunken. But nice words. Now here's the thing that confuses the heck out of me, and this is my next to last slide, but it's the last thing I'm actually showing you. This is a very expensively produced 6-page fold-out brochure from a different company in the United States that seems to be representing Telefunken studio equipment. It's Audio Fidelity. I mean, some is known about who this was, but what I would like to know was their specific business arrangement with Telefunken. Because if you look at it, it's from 1959. There's a copyright notice in the vertical type here on the left side. It says copyright 1959, and yet it has U47, M49, SM2, the Neumann stereo mic, which I think should have been an SM23 by this point, but it's an SM2. It has some of the small Neumann microphones. It has Neumann accessories. It has Schoeps mics. It has AKG mics. So I don't know what's going on. And I don't know to whom they were selling or who they were legally allowed to sell to. Here's the other 3 pages. They had loudspeakers and everything else that's typical of Telefunken at this point. ELA series amplifiers, right? This is everything has ELA V numbers. V is for Stärker in German, which is amplifier. So I'm ending on a mysterious note because I don't understand quite what was going on there. Apparently, their representation wasn't exclusive, and there were some loopholes of some kind. So if anybody has clues to that, I would be very, very thankful to hear them. And I hope people are still living and breathing. That is the end of what I did.
If I can add one thing to my story that I should have mentioned, you might want to use it for publicity. We recorded a symphony once with those Telefunken mics that I described, and Eugene Normandy was the conductor, and he said, the audio sounds better to me than Columbia Records gives me. He might have been flattering us, of course, but you never know.
Yeah. Well, Columbia used a lot of large diaphragm microphones.
Yes.
What can I say? I mean, they liked U67s and U87s a lot. And used
They
them,
went
I
to
think,
small
for things.
diaphragm later.
Oh, did it? Did they?
Yeah.
Good.
Yeah.
Well, David Smith is who was at least the chief engineer for them here in New York. I regard very, very highly, and I think he knew what he was doing very much, and the engineers here, very much so. I was an engineer for RCA, so that's the competition, but for sure.
When I knew David Smith, he was with Sony.
Yeah.
And he's the one that persuaded me to get a second. I've been using a pair of Schoeps for a long while, and I still like it and still use them. But then he played me a recording of a piano once. It was done with a pair of Schoeps, and then another one done with a pair of what's now called DPA, that were then called Berlin-Care. And the Berlin-Care was like a little veil was lifted. So I went out and bought 2 Berlin-Care mics as well.
Right. When DPA came in, how much dirty laundry should I talk about here? Okay, the None Such records by Marco Bohr and Joanna Nikrens, he was using M221s, M221Bs with the 3 pattern capsules. And the Omni setting of that capsule has a rise in the bass. And that became something of the Schoeps sound for Omni capsules, although it was strictly speaking a technical defect. And when DPA introduced their microphones, at first, their first microphones were Omni. DPA didn't make cardioids for a while. And they had ruler flat low frequency response, which was not as warm, but it was more accurate. That has to be said. And there were people who preferred one or the other on that basis.
From my experience, I agree with you 100%. Yeah. I use whichever I think I need for the situation.
I had a small comment about the early part of your talk in terms of the German people hearing things on the radio and taking them for literal truth. I mean, the United States had its issue with the landing of the Martians on Earth, the H.G. Wells' War of the Worlds with Orson Welles. When Pearl Harbor came along, my uncle heard that on the radio and he says, is this another H.G. Wells thing, or is it really happening?
The War of the Worlds, they even announced during the broadcast that this is an entertainment program.
Yeah, they did. They specifically did.
Yeah.
And yet everybody still thought, oh, the Martians are landing.
Well, there were people who missed that part because they tuned in later. So they thought they were listening to a live newscast.
But that show didn't have as big an audience as people try and claim, because there were other things. My parents lived in New York at the time, and they didn't even pay attention to it because they were listening to something else. But then I read that the audience for that radio drama was actually fairly small. The legend has lived on a lot bigger than the actual.
There were legends about people committing suicide. None of that happened.
Yeah, I know.
Well, I wonder if the small audience who were listening to it just called all their friends and said, go hide, go run, or whatever.
Yeah. I think they would have said, tune in.
Yeah, that's true too.
Any
David?
other questions? Go ahead, Gary.
Yeah. Is there a brief explanation about the current Telefunken company? How they came about? They must have bought the trademark in the U.S. or something.
No, they didn't.
No.
Okay. I have to be very restrained about this. Okay. I want to try and stick with things that I'm quite sure are true. The gentleman who began the company is named Tony Fishman. He's in Connecticut. And he had been dealing with clones and clone parts for some time before this. Now, I mentioned a couple of people who I thought deserved more credit. Dr. Küsters at Schoeps, Albert Hiller at the little tube factory. And I mentioned Oliver Arcud, although I didn't display his name on any of the slides. Oliver, as I said, used to work for Telefunken in Germany when he was quite young. When he moved to this country, and when Telefunken went out of business in the 80s, and there was this there was nobody left to renew the trademarks.
Yeah.
And Oliver did a trademark search on Telefunken and the Telefunken Star, the diamond label, and he discovered that they weren't trademarked in the United States, so he trademarked them for himself. Okay? And that's how Tony got it. He licensed it from Oliver. There was no, I mean, the Telefunken brand as an abstract entity was owned by Daimler-Benz at the time in Europe, but that doesn't give them priority as far as trademark registration is concerned if they're not actively using it in this country. So Oliver got it. And I have that from Oliver himself, by the way. That's not just stuff I learned between the lines. I talked with him a bunch. I translated some stuff for him and really admired the guy.
Well, I'm sort of aware in the United States that trademarks were supposed to, if you licensed them or claimed them, that you had them eternally with the Bureau of Copyrights and such, patent or trademarks and such. But also RCA ended up with a problem because apparently in Japan, when the Japanese had licensed from the old Victor Corporation, they also adopted the dog and phonograph, and
that's
so
from EMI.
Victor, they had that, and RCA couldn't do anything about it, so they ended up changing their own trademarks. But
no. I was working at RCA Studios then. That doesn't make sense if it's the story I think you mean. I believe that the rights to that symbol belong to EMI in England, and RCA licensed it from them. I don't think that there was any blockage with their use in Japan.
Well,
what did happen during my time at RCA Studios is that Bertelsmann, which had bought RCA Studios from GE, simply failed to renew their license for the trademark, partly because they didn't intend to continue using it. They thought, who cares about this dog and gramophone? We're BMG. Everybody's going to want to buy BMG records. I mean, the degree of corporate narcissism was unbelievable.
Well, I know that in terms of the dog and phonograph, it goes back to Victor in at least 1906. So, and I was thinking that it was RCA that eventually bought Victor Talking Machine and all of the material associated with it. But you can correct me if I'm wrong.
No.
In terms of the Victor phonograph records, I have one that goes back to before the 78 RPM was standardized, and it says 82 RPM on the label.
Wow.
So that's going back a ways, but
yeah, that's not my area. The one thing that I do, there's two things that I find worth noting is that the painting was painted over. That was originally a cylinder record player. Most of the modern ones that you see have a disc.
Right.
And the other thing is that what is the dog sitting on?
I should get that out.
Pardon?
Say it again.
It's sitting on its ass.
Well, besides that, it's something that has that syllable in it. It's the casket of his dead master. That's why they call it his master's voice.
Right.
It's because the dog is listening to a record of his master and thinking it's the real thing. So it's like, if you can fool a dog, a devoted dog, this must be a very lifelike recreation.
Really?
But it's kind of macabre. People don't seem to know about
And
that.
was that motto part of the trademark as well? His master's voice?
It was a trademarked entity, but I don't think it was part of the same trademark. And it may or may not have been the name of the painting that it was taken from, which I don't think was meant as advertising at first.
Okay.
Huh. That'd be a fun research project for somebody to look into.
Yeah.
That was quite challenging.
The Wikipedia articles on Nipper and his master's voice are trying to make sense of them is fun.
I've had real problems with Wikipedia as a source. I've been a source. I've written a number of Wikipedia articles, and I edit what I see that needs editing. But there is so much, especially in the field of audio, there's just so much mythology that's parading as factual claims.
Well, that's the audio. That's audio in general. You know, you can join Wikipedia. You can actually help edit and make those articles better.
I do a lot.
Ah, so do I. Not audio. Well, once in a while.
Yeah.
Good.
That's what, David, that's what's so cool about this presentation, is that you've done a huge amount of original research on this, and it's really wonderful to hear that.
You know, some of it is just looking at what's there. The only unique sources I have are Schoeps, right? Because I was given full access to the place and everything in it and everybody in it, which I still have and I'm still working on. I meant to say that I'm still involved in it, but it's hard to do that stuck in the United States.
Yeah.
But I'm doing what I can. And so everything I said about the other manufacturers comes from documents that are either publicly available or reasonably available in people's collections. And, you know, like that little table that I made of the early Neumann microphone and capsule models, Neumann publishes a table of all the models that they've ever made of anything. And some of that information came from there, but you have to put it together with what Telefunken put into their own product listings, and then it adds up to something that makes some sense. Mm-hmm. So I don't know if you call that original research, but some of it is of the nature of, let's see, if I add 2 to 2, what kind of a total am I going to get?
But you're going to the original documents and not going off somebody's account in books, a book or books.
I have to sometimes. There's a couple of sources that are in books and magazines that I think are more reliable than most. And one of them was that coffee table book by Rössler, Anselm Rössler. Mm-hmm. I can wave it in front of my camera here, if I can hold it up. It's this.
Mm-hmm. All right.
$60 or $70, and it's
hey, look at you guys.
Full of notes. Yeah, somebody else have it. Oh yeah,
Rod does.
Okay, good. Yeah, is yours the original edition or the second edition?
I'm not sure.
I want to find out what's different.
Okay,
I'm
come on,
always
no
curious to know.
competition there. No competition here.
I'm curious. No, I have both editions, but I have never sat down and gone page by page to find the differences because I'm always curious to know. It's expensive to produce the second edition of something. What was so important to them that they had to change it? And I want to know that.
Mine has a copyright date of 2003.
Uh-huh.
So
Well, I'll look at mine in a moment, but I just want to say there's a lot of primary source material in that book, and there are interviews with people who at least knew the answers to certain questions. Whether they were telling the full story or not is something else again. But there's a lot of first-person narrative that is quoted extensively in the book. And so it's at least worth considering as a kind of a source. The other is that David Smith, who we were talking about earlier, and somebody named Win Schwartau, who I don't know who is, or if he's still living, but I would like to meet him if so, did a lengthy interview or series of interviews with Stephen Temmer of Gotham Audio. And the quality of the information in the article that they published in, there was a magazine called Recording Engineer / Producer, RE/P.
Yeah.
Is way above average. It's not perfect, but it's way better than most. And you could do much worse than to believe what they're saying most of the time.
Do you know what the date of that article was?
I can dredge it up on my other computer, but I'd rather not try to do that right at the same time as I'm talking to you.
No, good.
Magazine.
Bob,
Pardon?
go ahead.
Oh, I was just saying I missed that magazine. Or you can find the old ones online.
Yes, actually, somebody put a link to that specific issue in the chat at the last week's meeting.
Oh, okay.
So if you have that saved off, you have the link.
Luke just posted it
last week.
Right.
Although that's every.
That's everything. That's not the Neumann one specifically.
Yeah.
But it's really easy to find that, and I'll get that to Dan, shortly.
Great. Any other questions for David about that wonderful presentation?
Not a question, but something I think is interesting. We talked about modern, what things would be in modern dollars, inflation and things. You look at, these old condenser mics from, Neumann and Schoeps and things, and obviously today on the used market, they're going for at least 8 or 10 times what they would have sold for originally. And, new Neumanns are expensive too, but you look at, like a Shure 545 list in 1961, I think when it came out was $85. And, today it's like 92. It's just amazing how it's, almost, it's, deflation, I guess, if it would have kept up with inflation, that would be, $800 or something.
I have charted Neumann's prices across the years, and they're on a constant dollar basis. Their stuff is less expensive now than it was.
Interesting. I had a question for you about the Schoeps heads. They have kind of a sculptural head looking thing, and it looked like the same. I don't have a picture.
The M921.
It had the same shape of head on a huge body mic and also on the little skinny.
Right.
Were the heads the same?
The internals of the heads were. One moment. I'm going to step out of camera for a moment.
Okay, go ahead.
Because I have one of them here physically.
Great. That's exciting.
Yeah.
If I can reach it without causing an avalanche.
I've done that before.
Yeah.
I was recording at a show once, and I had everything plugged in, and I stood up, and
reach
everything
right now without
unplugged.
causing a major avalanche of belongings.
Good.
Okay, it's the same acoustic design. Okay, the same two internal capsules, one Omni and one Figure 8. Some differences, some evolution. The earlier microphone is the CM51/3. The later one is the M201. The CM51/3 had a bayonet connector. I talked about the torpedo head on the Neumann mics.
Yes.
The other type of head is called a bayonet head. They use these military terms for them in both styles. Bayonet connector, because the way that you fastened it was to put it on and a pin went into a slot, then you rotated it and the pin was spring-loaded and went into a groove. So the original Schoeps microphones all had those bayonet heads of a different design from the Neumann. They're not interchangeable. And the later capsules were all screw-on. So that's the main difference between the two. The ones that I showed you the close-ups of all had threaded bases. So they would have been fine for the M200-201. But the earlier one with the nice dark purple tall body had a bayonet connector.
Okay, thanks. And then the other question was, most of the microphones you showed had a metallic, non-painted finish, but that brochure that you showed from the distributors that you didn't know about, was that American Elite or the other one?
It was the other one.
The other one.
Audio
All seem to be painted white, have white bodies.
That's the AKGs. Okay, AKG actually had a high luster white finish on the M250 and 251 had that finish. They also had a series, I believe it was the C60, small diaphragm condensers that used that same finish. It's lovely.
Yeah.
And Tony Fishman's recreations of those mics use the same finish. Absolutely gorgeous. But obviously not what you want for television work, unless the microphone is on camera. I mean, sometimes you want the microphone to be in the frame, right? And then you want a good looking microphone. And that's as long as you aren't getting reflections, that's a great microphone for that. But where you start seeing matte black finishes or matte gray finishes is in the 1953-54 time era, where the ARD was defining the standards for broadcast microphones with the AC701 tube. That's where Neumann and Schoeps started making their dark microphones. It's become the sort of signature color for Schoeps, and Neumann has started using it as well with the KM100 series. It used to be you could order any microphone in either finish, and that's still technically true with Neumann. But the ones that they import into this country by default, for example, the TLM 193 is always black. And if you want it in nickel finish, you have to special order it. The KM 100 series was like that as well.
Okay,
of course, I'm thinking of the ones that they rhodium plated or something to that effect.
Yeah.
I wonder.
Oh God, the chief engineer at Schoeps from 1970 through the early part of the 2000s was a friend of mine, Jörg Futke. And when the figure 8 single pattern capsule, okay, I have a history with them going back to then, and I had kind of badgered them. My favorite Schoeps capsule was this 3 pattern deal that was cardioid, omni, or figure 8. But the figure 8 frustrated me because it had limited frequency range. I mean, it cut off too early in the bass, in my opinion, and it cut off too early in the treble, and it wasn't their quietest microphone. So I said, would you be able to get flatter frequency response and better signal to noise ratio if you made a single pattern figure 8 capsule? And he said, yeah, it would be possible, but I'm not sure that there would be enough demand to justify the production costs for such a capsule. This could be different if someone were to order And he was writing to me in English at the time, which is weird because he usually wrote to me in German, but he was saying in English, this could be different if someone were to order some 10 pieces. Okay, now that's a mistranslation. Yeah, etwa 10 Stücke mean what I think he was thinking, and I actually asked him later and I confirmed this, means some tens of pieces. Now, their minimum batch for anything out of the ordinary was usually about 25. So, and it's larger now, but back then they would make 25 of something that they had never made before, just to satisfy a customer. And so Jerry Bruck, who was my friend, the distributor, placed an immediate order for 10 MK8 capsules. I mean, we made up that name, just thinking if it's a figure 8, that number wasn't used. So he said, here's an order for 10 MK8, send it to Germany. And Wuttke got it and said, what can we do? I said. They actually did have a design from years and years ago for a single pattern figure 8. They updated it and they started actually manufacturing that capsule, which today they sell in quite large numbers. But it didn't used to exist. And so when he decided to give me a pair of them as a thank you gift, and he had them gold plated.
Oh.
Okay, I record live concerts. Okay.
You don't want to take something gold.
I can't put a pair of gold. I mean, I'm trying to be as unobtrusive as possible.
Yep.
I don't want, I mean, Satz's law of microphone placement in a concert is there is no microphone so small that it won't block somebody's sight lines and they're going to complain about it. And there is no microphone so large that somebody's not going to bump into it and blame you for not making it more obvious.
And I found as well that I've had so many people shooting videos say, well, can you move your stereo pair off to the side so that I can get a better shot?
They would go
you don't realize how stereo works.
During the performance.
Oh, I've had people move mine too. And I'm like, no.
Yeah.
Number one, you keep your hands off my gear unless you explicitly get my permission to move it.
And the
That's number
no.
one. Yeah, exactly. It's there for a reason.
Well, one video director who was videoing some things that I was recording with M150s actually had his cameraman zoom in on one of them for about 20 seconds to show the audience what good audio they were supplying. So
that's justified. The one live session that I did, okay, as a studio engineer at RCA, I did mostly reissue work. So I was in a transfer studio my whole time there, except for one recording with the Tokyo String Quartet, where the producer was Jack Pfeiffer. He was an amazing guy, whom I did not get along with that well. And he didn't like my work either. And he used Neumann M50s. So I was, I was not, as his engineer for those sessions, I was told where to put the microphones and what microphones to use, because he already had his druthers, and he used the grand old man of the company. So I set things up the best I could his way, which had the microphones something like 30 feet away from the string quartet in our big studio. M50s can do it. It is, I listened in the control room and I couldn't believe, like, what I was seeing and what I was hearing just didn't add up to the same thing. You can't have an omnidirectional microphone that keeps focus from that kind of a distance, but the M50s do exactly that. That's what they're designed to do.
I mean, they have that capsule in that sphere that makes them directional to the high frequencies and then different at the lower.
It also gives them a forward bias in the mid and upper mid frequencies. The effect comes in very smoothly and in a very subtle way. So you don't hear it, like it doesn't hit you over the head. It just sounds like really good Omni microphones in a really good place in a really good room if you play your cards right. So again, that's a non-Schoeps, a Neumann product that I'm very, very glad to pay homage to. However, it's not designed by Neumann. It was designed by Groskopf and patented by Groskopf at the NWDR and licensed to Neumann for manufacture.
I have a question. Did you, when you worked with the Tokyo Quartet, I worked with the original one where there was a female player. Was that the one you worked with, or they've changed players a lot? I think there's at most one member who's still from the original quartet in the current Tokyo Quartet.
I have to say that I don't remember there being a woman in the quartet, and that's as much as I can remember about it. I didn't dare interact with the musicians, even though I am one. The whole thing of being a classical musician with a conservatory background and working as a recording engineer requires some discretion at times. There is a certain look. Okay, like there was a chamber music group that was tuning up on stage, and the piano was right there, and they were going to perform later with the pianist. So I went to the piano and played an A, which is what they tuned to. And I got an immediate dirty look. Who is this recording engineer who thinks he's a musician? And I kind of learned just not to do that, not to let on unless I'm asked. Jack Pfeiffer, Gentleman Jack, was the sovereign in his sessions. He disapproved of the fact that I brought a score to the sessions of the music, because an engineer isn't supposed to be concerned with the music.
How could you market for editing?
Actually, the editing was handled by somebody else later, just based on the verbal take cues that were on the recording. We were recording with SoundStream digital, and we had a SoundStream suite upstairs, and one guy who all he did his entire working life at RCA was to edit SoundStream. And he was a good musician also. He could certainly read a score, so it was fun.
This reflects something in a discussion I'd heard with a BBC recording engineer. One of the differences between the United States and Europe was that in Europe, the recording people were musicians with some technical education in terms of how to run the equipment, whereas in the United States, it was engineers that ran the equipment, and the musicians or the producer was the musician, and the engineers were supposed to take care of the rest of it and do what the producer told them to do. And if the violin wasn't right, they needed to change something to make it sound the way the producer wanted it. And I some of this I also heard from what's his name, Herman Klebanoff, who got into producing when he was concertmaster of the New Orleans Opera Orchestra, and they wanted him to come back to the sound booth to check the sound for them, and that's sort of how that was done in the United States. So anyway.
Well, I think all kinds of people hear all kinds of different things, and we need them all. There are people who are not trained musicians, but who can tell certain things that you want to know that are about a musical performance. Does it speak to them? And maybe there's a missed note, or maybe there's something, an indication in the score that's not really being followed. But they can still have a pretty good barometer for what makes musical sense without the sheepskin that I happen to have.
And on the subject of needing everybody, this has been a real lively discussion amongst a bunch of people, but there's a couple folks who haven't asked anything yet. Let's see, Vebev, do you have any comments or questions about this? I'm going to put them on the spot here.
Thanks, Dan. I really don't want to be put on the spot. Anyway, Actually, Gary pretty much asked my question about the modern Telefunken with the trademarks and stuff. So that was pretty much my question. So I was like, yeah, Gary asked this. So I'm like, okay.
Okay. So nothing
Also,
else?
yeah, just one similarity I noticed. Why is the Neumann and the Telefunken logo kind of looking similar in some sense?
There were other logos that also had the same basic shape. This is actually something I meant to mention. Right at the end of the war, 45, and also going for a while after it, there was a gentleman named Willison who had a company called Vlog that was actually licensed to produce bottle type microphones for German radio. And his bottle microphones are visually completely indistinguishable from Neumann's. And it makes, again, a real problem for searching the web for photos, because unless you can see the logo on the microphone, which might very often will be Telefunken, it might be this other company called WML or Vlog, WILAG. He supplied a lot of microphones to the radio, and when Schoeps got their first government loan for financing, basically they were comparing themselves to Vlog in terms of quality. They were saying our new little small pressure transducer goes to 19 kilohertz as opposed to the most frequently used type that the radio stations have, which is from Vlog. And their logo was a diamond shape as well.
Okay.
What are you going to do?
At least it was a diamond and not something worse, you know.
Yeah, true. Well, yeah, there are some photos of Neumann bottle microphones with eagles and swastikas on them too.
Oh,
I don't know where that came from.
A swastika would fit right into that diamond somehow, as I see it. But
yeah, I just noticed that as well.
Yeah, but that's older. The symbol is way older than the Nazi. I mean, the Nazis started
supposedly from Tibet.
22.
In the original.
Well, I thought the Tibetan one goes the other direction.
Well, there's American Indians used it as well somewhere in the Southwest, so that went in the other direction.
Right.
But, I'm wondering, could you say again who the designer for the capsule for the M50 was?
Dr. Herbert Großkopf. G-R-O. Großkopf. G-R-O, and that double S that looks like a capital B, K-O-P-F.
Okay.
And
I got it.
That's patented. If you want, I can send you a copy of the patent. He designed both the M49 and the M50.
Okay.
Or basically the principle of them, which is all you can patent. You can't patent a thing, but he developed the system for remote pattern control for a dual diaphragm capsule, where you vary the polarization voltage on the rear membrane with respect to the front or the back plate. And then he also developed this idea of a sphere of a pressure transducer, small pressure transducer embedded in a 4 centimeter sphere. The M50 is a large microphone with a small diaphragm.
Yeah.
People think of that sometimes as a large diaphragm microphone. It's not. It wouldn't work if it
It's
was.
just a small diaphragm and a big body.
Yeah.
All right,
and
good.
There are accessory spheres that you can put around the capsule of a small diaphragm pressure transducer today that gives you a lot of the goodies that you get from that type of microphone. Neumann and Schoeps both offer them as accessories.
Well, one of the things that was pointed out about the Neumann, though, was in the case of the TLM50 as well as the M50 or the M150, from directly behind the sphere, because of the laws of diffraction, the pressure wave diffracts around and it has a perfectly flat response from that direction for a very narrow angle from the back, which is interesting. And I've actually used that where I thought aiming it on the front or even 90 degrees off axis wasn't really sounding right for the instrument. So,
well, yeah, the problem is that that type of a capsule has a very narrow peak just in the front, like plus or minus 15 degrees of on axis.
Yeah, yes.
And if you go 90 degrees off, you've got a way different treble response in general.
Well, I noticed when I redrew the polar patterns amplified by the sensitivity of the microphone at the different frequencies, the convergence was about 60 degrees off axis.
Mm-hmm.
So, anyway, otherwise I probably would have ignored them completely, but something kicked in my head that said, oh, that's interesting. And when I went to look back at it, I got in line for the TLM 50s when they came out, in spite of their issues with that diaphragm that they originally had. But anyway,
yeah, okay. You could have, okay, there are alternatives. Okay, even from Neumann, there are alternatives that are worth considering, and I would certainly say from Schoeps, but the sphere is, like, from an acoustical standpoint, a nice shape. Okay, it's kind to sound waves in a funny way, right? Whatever effects it has, the transition into them is going to be gradual, and so no sharp corners is very nice, and you get some of that. We were talking earlier about a side-addressed cardioid, which was a cylinder. And you get some of that niceness that way too. That's one reason, like, my personal favorite Schoeps mics for cardioid or the supercardioid pattern are not the ones that they sell the most of, where you aim the microphone at the sound source. I like the ones that you set up vertically and the sound comes in at the side of the capsule, because what the sound is hitting is a rounded front. And what that does, both to my ear and in the graphs I've seen, is that at high frequencies, the off-axis response doesn't rise nearly as sharply. So reflected sound is picked up in a somewhat mellower way. And I like that. I like there to be clarity in the front where you're actually aiming the microphone, and let the reverberant, reflected sound be a little bit muted if it has to be, relatively speaking.
Mm-hmm.
Well, when I'm using the M150s to record orchestral work, I have them aimed more or less towards the back of the orchestra, so that the strings near the front are about 60 degrees off axis. And that means that as you go farther back in the orchestra, the high frequency response is picking up more details for the distant instruments.
Yeah.
So
that's it.
Cool. Let's get another question or comment. Jess, do you have anything you want to say?
Just overall, I mean, the depth and heaviness of that was really impressive, and just thanks for doing all that and sharing, and yeah, I'm still like so thank you.
Thank you. I had a wonderful time putting it together. I wish I had gotten more sleep.
That makes me so happy that you had a great time putting together something that was going to be pretty definitive for us as far as the subject. I like hearing everything that can possibly be said about whatever, and this met the bill. It was really good.
So does anybody know about that crazy double representation that Telefunken had in the United States? Anybody know?
I think I've seen, I have some old magazines here, which I think I've seen the audio fidelity, and I think it was more with the AKG. I will look that up before the next time I come on with you, but I won't see you next week. So that's the way you got to make a living these days, and it's not easy, but that's one of the days where.
That's for sure. It's too bad that Rick Chin left, because he might have had some insight on that. He was around then.
He usually does. Yes. No.
His wife makes him go and eat.
Yes.
Oh,
Yes.
how
And
awful.
speaking of which, we're in the last half hour here.
Yeah.
So I don't know that we need to do introductions. Do we? Everybody was here last week. Is there anybody who doesn't know somebody?
I wasn't.
Oh, Bob. So you introduce yourself, and let's introduce ourselves for Bob then. So,
Okay.
Go ahead, Bob.
I'm Bob Gudgel. I live in Everett, Washington, in the Seattle area for all my life, pretty much, except Eastern Washington for a couple of years. I designed, worked for most of the audio companies in this area here, and designed a lot of audio stuff and play in the basement and did sound and electronics design and all that. I'm a geek. Oh, look behind me. This is
Yeah.
that is a
Oh, yeah.
Telefunken ham radio or shortwave receiver. They made radios too, evidently.
Oh, yeah. Big time.
Do we know anything about what we're looking at here?
No, I just looked up Telefunken. I was looking up some images, and there it was. They have a whole bunch of things out there. They made all sorts of cool things. I'm a ham radio guy too, so this looks fairly new. This is after the 60s though, because it says megahertz instead of megacycles per second, or maybe that was already there in Europe.
In Germany, it was megahertz already.
That's interesting. That is it. No wonder. November. Anyway, great talk.
Thank you. I used to be KK2D. I was amateur extra.
Great. K7 IQ.
It's a wonderful way to learn about electronics.
Yes.
And at some point, Bob is going to give us a presentation about TAPCO and another one about phase linear. He worked there.
Oh, great.
Yep.
That, okay, so your set has a control for variable bandwidth, which I assume is IF bandwidth, and separate controls for audio frequency and radio frequency gain. Right. The one in the middle is the band switch. Bereich is the band in this case.
Yeah, bandwidth. Anyway, they have more than one radio. There's several of them that say Telefunken on them.
What's Ragelfong? Ragafong.
Oh my goodness.
Ragaland?
Where are you?
Ragaland?
Just to the right of the band switcher.
Regaland? There are two of them.
Right. That's what I was just saying. NF and RF Regelung HF Regelung is radio frequency regulation. It's a potentiometer. And NF is Niederfrequenz, which means audio frequency. So that's basically the volume control.
So that's not a fung, that's a lung.
Lung. Yeah.
Too bad. Too bad.
Regelung.
I don't know. This would not. I'm not sure if this is a super heterodyne or heterodyne or what.
It would be a super heterodyne, I'm sure.
I hope so. Would love to have one. It's beautiful.
All right, let's continue on here. David, give some background. I did a terrible introduction of you. What is your background story?
I'm a guy. I'm old.
Nah.
I studied as a classical musician, played in orchestras and chamber music groups, Western Pennsylvania, Eastern Ohio, and then when I went to college in Boston, lived there 15 years, got thrown out of school, and learned how to program computers during my off year. Got accepted back in, became a teaching assistant to a violinist named Rudolf Kolisch from Vienna, and started traveling with him to Europe, and that's how I got German into a condition where I can sometimes speak it on a good day. And started recording concerts in about 1970 with advent dynamic microphones and an Advent cassette recorder,
Hmm.
Which were really Bayer dynamic microphones, the cheapest ones they made, and gradually improved my way up to a stereo Nagra with Dolby A and AKGs, and then Neumanns, and then Schoeps, and got to know people at the company because I wrote to them for information, and now I don't know what I'm doing.
Great, thank you. Let's go to Rod.
Rod Evenson. My formal education in music began when I was about 7 years old, piano, and then also percussion. And that kind of continued into the high school band. In junior high school, I started getting my hands on a tape recorder and recorded a little piece in middle school called Islands of the Coronado with this little Shure Starlight microphone, and it sounded like crap. But anyway, eventually I went on to get a degree in engineering, electrical engineering, had worked for Tektronix for a while. The recording continued as a sort of a sideline and a hobby. But when I was working at Tektronix, I was getting paid well enough that I could go out and buy something other than a sports car or an airplane. And I went off and bought several Neumann microphones and a decent Ampex tape recorder. And it continued on from there. So, but still the engineering jobs continued heavily up until 1997. And after that, it went all recording. The turning point was essentially getting a computerized editing system. And that I did because some local recording operations would take my master tapes to turn into a CD and mess it up. And I said, I can't let this go on. So, so that's where it went from there. And it's what I'm doing to this day. Anyway.
All right, great, thanks. Eric?
Cool.
Yes, that I'm a tone meister and sound designer. Now in Poughkeepsie, New York, retired college professor. But was a classical music television producer for a long while, and then also done stuff for public radio too, because even public television doesn't do much classical music in the United States anymore. I worked with many, many well-known artists. I also studied composition and conducting with Pierre Boulez. But anyway, my first recorder that I owned was actually a disc recorder. A school was throwing out a record cut disc recorder, and I rebuilt it and got it to work. So even in college, I could give my students discs, my friends discs. They didn't have tape recorders with open reels. And but I said, oh, I recorded this myself. And then, but the first time I heard a recording that got me intrigued, because I was 6 years old. In 1948, my parents went to a friend's house that had a wire recorder. And I heard that and I said, oh, that's magic. And from then on, I wanted that. But of course, we couldn't afford that but at that time. But anyway, so then I, of course, got into tape and everything. I got into television and also, and then later also I was in the advertising business for a while. So I've done a variety of jobs in my life. And I've been a college professor for over 30 years as well, teaching both audio courses especially, but some video production, television directing and stuff as well.
Oh,
Cool,
excellent.
great.
Did you use film? Also in the video of the TV stuff?
Somehow your voice is distorting. I can't hear.
Yeah, you're dropping out, Bob.
Did you do use any film?
Oh, Eric, you
Eric,
muted yourself.
Yeah.
Eric, you muted yourself.
Sorry, there we go. Yeah, I shot a lot of film when, I was a film major actually in undergraduate, and when I was in the advertising business, we shot a lot of film because at that time there was no portable video gear. It shows how old I am. I'm 78. So we shot all commercials on location were all shot on film.
Yep. Well, back in the early 70s, late 60s, my dad was a TV newsman, so a little bit of news gathering and even some reporting. And that was 16 millimeter.
Yeah,
All
most,
right.
most of what I've done
Yeah.
is 16. I did a little bit with 35.
Wow.
Okay, great. Thanks. Jess.
Hi, my name is Jess Berg, and I'm originally from Minnesota. Came up singing, started playing guitar when I was 14. Had a Tascam 4-track cassette recorder in high school and hanging out at a buddy's recording studio. Was in bands. Ended up going to audio production and engineering school in Minneapolis starting 2002. And love studio work. I was able to do some stuff there, but I started running live sound in 2003 and pretty much just took off from there. And ran sound at jazz clubs in Minneapolis for years and was the concert and event coordinator for Minneapolis Parks for 3 years. Ran a bunch of outdoor venues there, hundreds of concerts each summer. And then taught at a school as well about a South by Southwest course, and we'd take students down and do a showcase and do the whole conference, and loved what I was doing, but knew I really wanted to get out on the road and just see, kind of spread my wings and see what kind of magic I could stir up. And so I had a buddy and really good best friend from middle school who had extra space in LA, and I just went for it and ended up getting on the road. And first gig was front of house / tour manager for direct support on like a North American club run. So hop in a Sprinter van, and this woman who was co-managing was also like a A-level tour manager, and she's like, I like your resume, you leave in a week, I'll teach you everything I know. I was like, amazing.
Wow.
And yeah, so we ended up working together on a bunch of projects, and then word of mouth and everything kind of snowballed, and I had a great run. And LA's always got a spot in my heart. But then I went to grad school for music industry administration, just because I wanted to kind of lock something in for whatever happens. And I like learning, so. But I kind of burnt myself out, and I had some friends up here in the Pacific Northwest, and as soon as I was done with grad school, I hightailed it up here. And yeah, so I'm in Bellingham, Washington, mostly live sound on some broadcast stuff, and just really laying low. And yeah, just happy to be here. So great to see everyone.
Are you staying warm enough there? It looks like you could be warmer.
Yeah, well, so I had just turned on my little space heater when we started the meeting, and it was a little chilly suddenly, and so yeah, but I'm good. Thanks.
Good. Thanks, Jess.
Small rooms.
Luke.
Luke Pahalski. I'm in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. And just briefly, Jess, you've now reminded or inspired me that I need some Christmas lights in my office here. But I've got a computer science degree. By day, I'm a software developer, systems administrator. But as with many folks here, I've been interested in audio and recording since I was a little kid. I remember in kindergarten having a tape recorder and recording things and stuff. These days, just do various things, hobby stuff, remastering and recording of shows when we are able to have shows in non-pandemic times. I host house concerts, been doing that for several years. So, and then various historical type stuff, like with Dan, looking up stuff for the Columbia 30th Street Studios. That's how we kind of connected. So,
all right, great. Thank you. Vaibhav.
Can you hear me, guys?
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah, because last time I remember. Yeah, so hi guys, Vaibhav Ahuja, all the way from New Delhi, India here. Just a student interested in all things audio. and currently leaning towards more towards studio activity and especially immersive sound, to be specific.
Great. Okay. Thank you. Janie.
Yeah, Janie Wallach, and back when bands used to play live, I used to record them.
Okay, good. Thanks, Gary.
I'm Gary Louie. I am the recording guy at the University of Washington in Seattle, and I'm a life member of the AES. I'm secretary of the Pacific Northwest AES section, and I'm chair of the AES Tellers Committee.
All right, great, thanks. And I'm Dan Mortensen, and I was the chair effectively of both the sound reinforcement and historical tracks at the convention. And I'm not a historian either, but it sure is interesting to look into that stuff. And I'm actually doing a gig tomorrow and the next day doing no PA, but picking up the sound from a quartet of Celtic musicians and giving it to the person to the recording, the video recordist. And that's my first real gig since June. I usually do PA stuff. And I'm happy to be the host of these events and hear everybody's stories and hear what you have to say. So it's 10 minutes now until our end time of 7, our nominal end time of 7. And I can't tell you how happy I am about how David got into doing that and that presentation for us and worked so hard on it and did such a great job. And
Yeah, that was awesome.
And despite the personal hardship of doing that too, I certainly feel for you there, you know.
That wasn't more so for this than it is for anything else that I'm doing with Schoeps.
Okay. Somebody had to do it.
Yeah, but I know, but it's still hard. It's still hard to look at that stuff.
I mean, but compared to living through it.
Yes.
Well, yeah. Yes. But thanks for doing the work, man. Thanks.
Yes, absolutely. And that's a reminder that someone else can do that same thing for us next week, should they choose to. And I have to say that it was real interesting hearing you guys, David, Rod, Eric, and maybe other people too, talking about your recording experiences just round robin. And I'd be happy to listen to that for quite a bit more if you guys wanted to. I don't know how to organize that myself. So if we want to just do it, or if you want to organize it somehow between now and then, that would be fun if you're interested.
Yeah, I think even just kind of informal. I mean, just people starting to talk about various different events that it had throughout their career. After all, we have a long time. There's no need to rush through. And then we just change from topic to topic according to what people do, rather than focusing like today on Telefunken and stuff. Just talk, because I have experience. I'm sure everyone here has, from what you said in your bios, have a lot of experience, a lot of interesting things, including things that go wrong and things that went more perfectly than you thought they would and all that.
That works for me. And I'll add to that I'm hoping that Bill Hanley joins us again.
Yeah.
And
Chris.
Yeah, I don't know about Chris. That seems to be a tougher nut, but Hanley seemed real interested in what we're doing and is happy to talk about his career, which is focused on sound reinforcement. But he had a prior obligation today, so he's not here. But I'm hoping he joins us again, and I'm also hoping that he expressed an interest in talking about the Fillmore East and the sound system that was there, and I'd be happy to hear about that too.
Yeah,
so I just want to declare that as much as the recording contingent is important to the group here, having the guy who was there back at the beginning of large scale concert sound talking to us and sharing his memories, that's real important to me. So as much as he wants to be presenting something, I'm happy to let him run. And I'm also happy to have you guys have anybody talk about whatever they want to talk about. That's the
Audio
point of this.
great
Bob, what?
and stuff.
You're cutting way in and out. You must be barely triggering your gate somehow.
I'm sorry.
That's
I
okay.
need to hook up the Neumann again, my mixer.
Yeah.
My Neumann's gone telefunky.
But what was your comment that I stopped you
I
from
can't
saying?
remember now. Oh, the audio history.
Okay.
It's good stuff.
It
And I
really
hope
is.
Gordon will join us again too.
Yeah, I don't know what his story is this week. I haven't talked to him since last week, but he's really given us a lot of really great stuff.
yeah.
About,
he loses a lot of sleep over this.
He sure does. He sure does. Every week.
He's
Just
on
like
the one
Bebev.
hand. Gordon's on the one hand, and Vebev is on the other end of the time spectrum, and it's just impressive continually.
Oh yeah, Bebev is ready to start his day.
That's right.
Well, before you got here, go ahead, tell him, Bebev.
Yeah, like my sleep schedule has been messed up, so like I've been waking up the entire nights. So I gotta go sleep now.
Yeah, he's gonna go to bed after this.
Oh, you've been losing sleep too. I'm glad that we can affect your life.
David, are you still in contact with Jerry Brook?
Yes.
You might pass along to him. Once upon a time, I transferred from analog tape to digital the recording archives of Theodore Bloomfield. And afterwards, I had lunch with Jerry's mother-in-law, Marge Bloomfield. So,
well, he's married to Louise Bloomfield.
Okay, that's right. So I had lunch with the mother-in-law, if you will.
Okay.
But Louise is the daughter of the conductor, Theodore Bloomfield. So.
I was wondering whether Jerry was still on. I bought a lot of stuff from him over the years, but haven't seen him at all recently. Is he still living in New York for a while? He also had a place in Saugerties, which is very near here in Poughkeepsie.
Correct.
I talked about the figure 8 mics, and that earlier tonight that somebody talked about the figure 8 single capsule being vented, and I had he pointed out that its base rolled off fairly early. So you can correct it with EQ, but he was kind of, because I said I liked using the what do they call it, where you use the figure 8 mic in the middle and the
mid-side.
Yeah, mid-side, and and he said, well, this is a good one. He said, but the bass will roll off on the figure 8. But he said you can correct it with EQ. But I didn't buy that one. I bought Schoeps microphones. I wound up not buying a figure 8. I do own, for my personal studio, I do own several, for concert recording, several ribbon mics that have, of course, an excellent figure 8.
Okay.
Yeah, well, one of the things about a small diaphragm condenser bidirectional microphone is that the pressure wave at the low frequencies diffracts around it and self-cancels it out. That's what pulls the low end down on those. The only alternative in that regard is the proximity effect. But and even ribbon microphones suffer from that. So
yeah, the thing is, okay, the roll off in the low at the bottom of a single diaphragm figure 8 is a very, very even 6 dB per octave.
Yes.
It lends itself to equalization very nicely.
Yeah. Well, that's what Jerry said. I just, at the time, we're doing something different. But no, it was interesting. I mean, he knew his stuff, as you mentioned, and he promoted things. But he was honest about what they had there. So that's, sometime, time is running out now. Maybe next week we can talk about some things. I'd like to talk about microphones that aren't just Schoeps. I'd like to talk. I have some questions and some interesting comments about my, well, now they call it DPA, but mine still say Berlin Kier. microphones and about the ribbons mics that I own, and people can talk about some of their personal gear and why they use it and what it's been good for and when it's let them down.
Great. That's a
Good
good
one.
start
Yeah.
to good place to stop and take up again.
Yeah.
That'd be fantastic. Got to have Rick on that too. And,
Yep.
well,
Yep. We'll have to do it before 4:30 or 5.
Thanks again. Have a
Thank
good
you.
day.
All right.
Thanks,
Yeah,
everyone.
definitely.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody, and
Thanks.
David especially.
Yeah.
Take
Yeah.
care, everyone.
Thank the rest
See you
of you.
next week.
awesome.